Committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Ambassador Wells and Ms. Friedman, welcome. Welcome to members of the public and the press as well, and we're glad to have our friends from C-SPAN with us today as well. We meet this morning so the committee can conduct oversight of the Trump administration's policy towards Afghanistan, and I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. For months, we've been attempting to get some visibility into the ongoing peace negotiations without success. We all want peace. We all want the fighting in Afghanistan to end, but Congress needs to know what a potential deal looks like. Members on both sides need a chance to ask questions and offer views. And in the last few weeks, we've seen the Afghan reconciliation process go off the rails in a spectacular fashion. We learned from a presidential tweet that the administration was planning to host the Taliban at Camp David the same week that we mark the anniversary of 9/11. We learned that the president upended that arrangement, and we learned that the peace deal evidently is dead. If reporting is accurate, the president's desire to get the credit and look like a deal maker got the better of him again, and now months and months of diplomatic efforts seems to be thrown out the window. As a committee that oversees American foreign policy, we understandably had a lot of questions about this diplomatic effort, and the administration's refusal to provide us and the American people answers prompted me a week ago to subpoena our top negotiator, Ambassador Khalilzad, to testify today. Just to be clear, I do not take subpoenas lightly, and I would not have issued this one had we not sent 3 letters inviting him and asking Secretary Pompeo at a hearing to send him. We simply couldn't wait any longer. And after I issued that subpoena, I spoke with Secretary Pompeo at the State Department's request. He offered to send an official from the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs to testify, and for Ambassador Khalilzad to brief myself and Mr. McCall in a classified setting. I said I would consider an accommodation, but only if the ambassador briefed every member of this committee, Democrats and Republicans, in a classified setting, the same courtesy that was afforded to the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Anything less than that was a non-starter for me and for Mr. McCall. I'll let him speak for himself, but we were eye to eye. We saw this just the same way. We were defending the integrity of the legislative process and the integrity of our committee. Last evening, after a few days of negotiations, the State Department finally agreed to this compromise, and I withdrew the subpoena on Ambassador Khalilzad. We just wrapped up that classified briefing, and we're going now to continue our examination of these issues with the officials before us. So let's take a step back. I know that the idea of negotiating with the Taliban may seem abhorrent. I'm from New York City, and for myself and a lot of New Yorkers who lived through 9/11, it's a tough pill to swallow. And since then, many brave Americans have lost their lives at the hands of Taliban fighters. But here's the reality after 18 years of war. The Taliban still exists. We need, unfortunately, to deal with that fact. And the adage remains true: you don't make peace with your friends. And believe it or not, there's some common ground. For starters, the Taliban wants our troops out of Afghanistan, and we want our troops home. So where do we go from there? In my view, any viable deal needs to be built on 3 pillars. The first is that the Taliban must pledge that Afghanistan will never be used again as a base to plan attacks against the United States and our allies. We understand that the administration secured that commitment from the Taliban in earlier negotiations. Secondly, the Taliban must agree to separate from al-Qaeda, something they've indicated they would do, and renounce violence, including against the Afghan people or government. And lastly, the Taliban and the Afghan government must engage in a good faith process that can lead to reconciliation among all Afghans. This area still has a lot of unanswered questions, and with the president declaring the deal dead, it's not clear where we go from here. The way I see it, we need to use whatever leverage we can to promote intra-Afghan dialogue. The president suggested that peace would not be possible unless we first had a ceasefire in place. Well, guess what? There was a ceasefire in June 2018 to celebrate Eid. And what did we do to seize on this opportunity? Nothing. Why? Because the administration has hollowed out the State Department. We've complained about this for a long time. State Department Inspector General found that the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs has, quote, lost both staff and expertise, unquote, under the administration, including experts on peace talks with the Taliban and reconciliation. So what will this administration do to get a second bite at the apple? Another ceasefire that might create an opening for more dialogue? I'd like to hear from our witnesses about that, among many other issues. Because one thing is crystal clear. There is no military solution to end the fighting in Afghanistan. And if there is another opportunity, even following the President's disastrous attempt at deal-making, to forge a peace that advances American security interests, we need to consider those options. We owe this to the men and women who have fought and died in this war. We owe it to those who lost their lives or their loved ones at 9/11. We owe it to future generations of Americans who don't want to see our country entrenched in endless war, and to the Afghan people who want a peaceful and prosperous future for their country. We'll soon hear from our witnesses, but first I'll yield to our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any opening remarks he might have. And I want to thank him publicly for his cooperation. As usual, we work together, and we believe it brings good results, not only for the Congress, but for the American people as well. Mr. McCall.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I also would like to thank Ambassador Khalizad for briefing committee members this morning, where we had a robust and informative discussion on a range of timely issues. I look forward to staying engaged with him. I do want to say, for the benefit of the members of this committee, the chairman and I stand unified in our commitment to the preserving the integrity of this committee. This is the second oldest committee in the Congress, dating back to the Continental Congress. We do have Article 1 constitutional oversight responsibilities, and we do deserve that respect. Just last week, we commemorated the 18th anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks that took the lives of 3,000 innocent people. It was one of the most tragic days in American history. In the aftermath of 9/11, counterterrorism and homeland security became our top priority. It was necessary to go on the offense militarily and attack the terrorists abroad. That strategy included invading Afghanistan, removing the Taliban, and destroying al-Qaeda. Since 2001, we have achieved many successes on the battlefield and through diplomacy. Specifically, we have decimated the leadership of al-Qaeda. We captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, killed Osama bin Laden, and most recently removed his son and rising leader, Hamza bin Laden, from the battlefield. And most importantly, we have not allowed Afghanistan to be the staging ground for another devastating attack on our homeland. We have also helped implement many political and social reforms. Millions of Afghanistan people have voted in democratic elections at all levels, and Afghan women who are not allowed to attend school or hold a job during the brutal reign of the Taliban in the 1990s have made significant gains, and I was pleased to hear women were part of these negotiations. These accomplishments have not been without great sacrifices. Over 2,300 Americans have given their lives in this conflict, including Sergeant First Class Jeremy Griffin, who was killed in action in Afghanistan just on Monday. Over 20,000 more have been wounded. We must never forget their courage or the price we have paid in both blood and treasure to protect our homeland and to build a better future for Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the Taliban has made significant gains. Today, they control almost 50% of the country and have become increasingly violent. But after 18 years on the battlefield, the American people and members of Congress want to know what our plan is for peace moving forward. I'm glad the President decided against welcoming leaders of the Taliban to Camp David, particularly in the week of 9/11. Perhaps the current suspension of talks will allow us to reevaluate our strategy. And this committee, Mr. Chairman, I should say, and the Congress, have a role in the process. There's no doubt that all of us would like to see this war come to an end, and I fully support the administration's efforts to bring a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. But there's also real doubt that the Taliban can act as legitimate partners for peace. By all accounts, their ties to al-Qaeda remain intact. And further, the Taliban is not a monolithic organization. To only engage with the organization's central leadership overlooks local power brokers who do not always follow them. We also have to keep in mind many in the Taliban have some longstanding objections to a negotiated peace. They think our military will come home no matter what. I think some more extremist factions were responsible for that attack just to end the peace negotiations. And as Ambassador Crocker has assessed, and I've visited with him many times in Afghanistan, when he said, quote, "The Taliban will offer any number of commitments, knowing that when we are gone and the Taliban is back, we will have no means of enforcing any of them." We must also avoid the same mistake President Obama made in Iraq by withdrawing all of our troops. For the purposes of preventing another 9/11 style attack on our homeland, I personally believe that we should keep a residual force in place to focus on counterterrorism intelligence and partner force training. I'd also like to thank Ambassador Wells and Ms. Freeman for being here. This hearing really comes at a critical time. As I can say, we did commend Ambassador, the Primary Ambassador and Special Envoy this morning for his commitment and his service to the country in what I consider to be one of the most difficult negotiations on the planet. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Alice Wells is the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for South Central and Asian Affairs. Karen Freeman is the Assistant to the Administrator in the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs at the United States Agency for International Development. I again thank you both for your service and for your testimony this morning. Without objection, the witnesses' prepared testimony will be made part of the record, and I'll now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each to summarize their testimony. We'll start with Ambassador Wells.
Good morning, Chairman Ingle, Ranking Member McCall, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning on the Trump administration's policy in Afghanistan. Last week in New York, Washington, Kabul, and around the world, we commemorated the 18th anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the United States. And when the U.S. began its military engagement in Afghanistan, our core interest was clear: to ensure that Afghanistan would never again be a platform for a terrorist attack on America. And in that regard, our mission over the last 18 years, in partnership with our NATO allies, has been a success. Since 9/11, no terrorist group has used Afghanistan to attack our shores. But the threat remains significant. Afghanistan remains a haven for terrorist organizations. ISIS Khorasan has demonstrated the intent to organize or inspire attacks in the U.S. and Europe. It has the capacity and willingness to indiscriminately kill civilians who do not support their nihilistic ideology. In April, Russia, China joined us in calling on the Taliban to make good on its commitments to cut ties with international terrorist groups, to prevent terrorist recruiting, training, fundraising, and to expel any known terrorists. While the United States remains committed to countering the threat of terrorism from Afghanistan, the administration understands that the American people are ready to end this war responsibly. Military power alone will not bring peace to Afghanistan or eliminate the threat of terrorists exploiting Afghan soil. A negotiated political settlement accepted by most Afghans remains the best way to ensure a durable peace and to enable Afghans to focus on ridding their country of international terrorists. In the last 12 months, we've made significant progress toward this objective. The Taliban engaged in dialogue with the United States and discussions with their fellow Afghans, including Afghan government officials, at an intra-Afghan dialogue in Qatar this July. Special Representative Khalilzad and his team consulted with the government of Afghanistan and stakeholders across society. We built regional and international support for peace, enlisting the help of Pakistan, Russia, China, the Gulf, EU members, and regional partners. And consultations within the U.S. government are continuing on the best way forward. As we foster the conditions for direct negotiations between the Afghans, we're rationalizing our risk and our exposure to ensure a sustainable diplomatic assistance and military presence. Diplomatically, we've reduced our civilian direct hire presence from over 1,100 personnel in 2011 to around 500 staff today. Developmentally, we have tapered our civilian assistance from over $4 billion in 2010 to about $480 million today. Our international partners are now contributing 3/4 of all development and humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. Militarily, we've reduced our presence from over 100,000 troops in 2011 to less than 14,000 today. NATO is constantly evaluating the requirements of the 39 allies and partners in Resolute Support Mission. Afghanistan is a different country than it was in 2001. Afghan troops are leading the fight against ISIS-K and the Taliban. Over 9 million students are enrolled in school, 39% of them girls. 1/3 of the 4 million voters in the parliamentary elections were women. Afghan farmers are beginning to export high-value crops, and a nascent private sector is strengthening supply chains and building market linkages with India and Central Asia. But challenges remain. Over half the Afghan population lives below the poverty line. Corruption, government malfeasance, and record-high opium production threaten sustainability. We will continue to hold the Afghan government accountable for combating corruption, and we will adjust our assistance levels accordingly. Afghanistan is holding a presidential election on September 28th. We've called for the Afghan government and electoral institutions to ensure the election will be credible and transparent. We've emphasized that all candidates are accountable to the code of conduct they signed, pledging to respect the electoral process. Afghans have the right to vote without fear of intimidation, attack, or violence. And the Taliban statements threatening election workers and voters are naked intimidation. We offer our strong support to the Afghan security forces who are in charge of electoral security and sacrifice their lives on a daily basis. Even as Afghanistan goes to the polls, Afghans cannot pause their efforts to advance peace. Every Afghan must be invested in a political process that brings security and reconciliation after 40 years of violence. Finally, the United States will continue to safeguard American security. For too long, the Taliban have taken comfort in their conviction that our engagement is unsustainable. Our friends and adversaries should understand our interest in protecting American citizens is enduring as we advance a responsible way toward peace, development, and security in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wells. Ms. Friedman.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the role of USAID in supporting U.S. interests in Afghanistan. Since May of this year, development and humanitarian partners have sustained 3 separate attacks by the Taliban that resulted in loss of life and injury of staff. These are senseless attacks on people who have dedicated their lives to improving Afghanistan's future. USAID extends our condolences to the families of the deceased, and we hope for fast recovery to those who have been wounded. We echo Secretary Pompeo's call for the Taliban to stop attacking civilians. This week's attack by the Taliban on energy infrastructure in Baghlan province cut imported electricity to 12 Afghan provinces, including power to Kabul's industrial parks. We're glad to hear this morning that power is being restored, and we're happy to note that the USAID-constructed Tarakil power plant is providing immediate backup supply of energy, as intended, for critical uses, including hospitals and the Kabul airport. This morning, there's also news of an attack that damaged a hospital. Attacks on civilians, as well as projects that facilitate and advance the economy and the standards of living for the Afghan people, must stop. Earlier this year, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul led a review of all U.S. civilian assistance, which directed departments and agencies to focus on 3 objectives: supporting the Afghan peace process, preserving stabilization of the Afghan state, and assisting Afghanistan's transition to self-reliance to create conditions for a political process. USAID's strategy in Afghanistan aligns with and supports these objectives by accelerating private sector-led economic growth, advancing education and health gains made over the past 18 years, particularly for women and girls, and increasing accountability between the Afghan government and its citizens. USAID has pressed the government of Afghanistan to take the lead in the country's own future and make development gains sustainable. Just a few weeks ago, I I joined my USAID colleagues in Kabul to close the formal review of U.S. government civilian assistance to Afghanistan. We unequivocally stressed to the Minister of Finance that transparent, effective, and citizen-responsive government systems are essential to achieving private sector growth and attracting investment. The U.S. government continues to convey to all Afghans that their country's relationship with the international community will depend heavily upon the inclusivity of any potential settlement, which must preserve the rights and dignity of women. We also expect the upcoming presidential elections, scheduled for September 28th, to be transparent and credible. The Afghan government must recommit and redouble its efforts to enhance transparency, increase citizen responsiveness, and reduce the corruption that weakens the Afghan citizens' faith in democratic civilian government. Over the past 18 years, USAID-funded gains have been significant. In the energy sector, as Ambassador Wells said, more than 30% of Afghans now have access to the power grid. More importantly, USAID is also working directly with the Afghan National Electric Utility to improve its management systems and ability to collect revenue. This assistance has helped to double revenue collection and increase its customer base by 73% in just a few years. In health, USAID is working with the Afghan Ministry of Public Health to increase access to basic health care and ensure the sustainability of health through the development of effective public-private partnerships. In the education sector, not only have USAID programs supported millions of students, but a future generation of Afghan women will have opportunities in STEM fields, such as a result of a USAID partnership with Texas A&M University. Afghanistan is a different place than it was in 2001, and its people are capable of more if it achieves citizen-responsive good governance and transparency. USAID is prepared to support emerging needs and opportunities that could arise from a political settlement. The trajectory of Afghanistan remains clear. Civilian assistance helps create the economic and social conditions necessary for peace and self-reliance by focusing on long-term, broad-based development and reinforcing efforts to reduce violence and stimulate a peace settlement to end the conflict with the Taliban. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for inviting me here today. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me ask both of you this question. You both mentioned in your remarks the recalibration efforts of U.S. assistance to Afghanistan moving forward. Could each of you please explain what drove the department to propose these significant cuts to our assistance and how such a cut would support intra-Afghan peace and reconciliation?
Thank you, sir. We were trying to ensure that the level of assistance that we were providing for Afghanistan was sustainable, was structured in a way that encourages the rise of the private sector, and that it elicits better government performance so that the government increasingly has the capacity and the ability to assume all functions of a sovereign state. And at the same time, ensure that our investment in Afghanistan reflects the level of investment given global threats. Obviously, there's been a lot that's changed since 9/11. Afghanistan is not the only country in which we face a terrorist threat. And so we wanted to be able to signal through the embassy posture and the aid restructuring that we are committed to the long-term development of Afghanistan, but not overcommitted to the point that we're assuming an unreasonable or even a counterproductive level of nation building.
Ms. Friedman?
Thank you for the question. As always best practice, USAID regularly reviews its mission's presence worldwide. And in Afghanistan, over the last 18 months, we established a new development strategy that focuses on establishing the conditions necessary for peace and self-reliance, and responsibly revised the portfolio based on lessons learned and input from various stakeholders. So during the recent embassy-led assistance review, we sought to further consolidate the portfolio while ensuring its ability to manage and provide proper oversight over taxpayers' resources and our ability to implement the program. We took into account the interests and the feedback from our congressional committees and from the administration's priorities to support the Afghan peace process, to preserve the stabilization of the Afghan state, and to assist Afghanistan's transition to self-reliance. During the course of the review, we had a great deal of input and a lot of thought on what that consolidation should look like, and took that all in as recently as a couple of months ago, and have honed down and consolidated the portfolio to mesh with the appropriate number of staff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The UN assistance mission to Afghanistan found that the NATO and Afghan security forces were responsible for more civilian casualties than the Taliban in the first 6 months of 2019. What accounts for the increase in civilian casualties at the hands of NATO and pro-government forces? Have there been any significant changes in the rules of engagement? Is that the reason? And how has this impacted Afghans' view of their own security forces? Ambassador.
Coalition forces working with the Afghans do everything possible to try to avoid civilian casualties and implement the highest levels of accountability. And I would contrast this, sir, with what is the focus of the Taliban in targeting civilians, as we saw in the attack on election workers, the attack against the hospital, all of which have just happened this week. I think statistically, the Taliban over time have been the largest contributors to civilian casualties. The statistics that we saw, which we don't necessarily agree with the methodology, are an aberration. And I think the intent of the U.S. forces and the Afghan forces is very different from the intent of the terrorists who are literally terrorizing the Afghan civilian population.
Thank you. Ms. Freeman, do you agree?
I would cede that territory to Ambassador Wells. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. McCall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Taliban hosted and protected al-Qaeda both pre-9/11, on 9/11, and after 9/11. So there's a healthy amount of skepticism about cutting a deal with the Taliban. I remember visiting with Ambassador Crocker in Kabul when this idea was launched in our military. I guess the question is, what other alternative do we have when they occupy and own 50% of Afghanistan? I suppose, Ambassador, that is a necessary step, or is there any other alternative to that?
The peace framework agreement that was negotiated by the U.S. government in discussions with the Taliban is very much a conditions-based approach. The Taliban are focused on securing the removal of U.S. and international forces from Afghanistan. They understand from 9 rounds of negotiations that that can only come about if they are committed to working to ensure that Afghanistan cannot be a platform for international terrorism. And
I'm glad to hear that's condition-based and not a timeline. Would that also, could that include the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces?
I can't speak to what ultimately a peace agreement is going to look like. As you know, for now, the process is suspended. But certainly the discussion was very much about the interrelationship between the presence of troops, international forces, and the ability of the Taliban to ensure that not only were there no international terrorists allowed to operate on soil that they had influence over, but no recruiting, no fundraising, no tolerance of sanctuary, any connections whatsoever.
And of course, if that happens, it would sort of snap back, if you will.
Right.
Correct. I always think, given our history lessons from Iraq, and I'm glad the president decided to keep a residual force in Syria. And I think we should have one in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future, if only to protect the homeland from an external operation like 9/11. Let me ask you about ISIS and the Khorasan group. When I was chairman of Homeland Security, particularly in 2015, 2016, pretty terrifying briefings, external operations. The Khorasan group always one of the most active groups out there, and so the notion is that the Taliban is actually going to war with ISIS and the Khorasan group. How accurate is that information?
The Taliban do oppose the ISIS Khorasan group. They devote resources, significant manpower resources to combat the Taliban, or to combat ISIS Khorasan. I think one of the reasons we put such an emphasis on peace is that we need Afghans to be united against ISIS Khorasan. And ISIS has been able to take advantage of the fact of the insurgency and the war that's going on in Afghanistan to exploit territory, despite what have been very fierce efforts by Resolute Support Mission and others to target them. We see a resilience and an enduring presence in places like Nangarhar and Kunar, where it can be quite difficult to eliminate them or eliminate their presence entirely.
And that's based on the premise that the Taliban would be more willing to partner with the Afghan government than they would with ISIS?
We would assume a peace agreement would unify, provide a unified government that would reflect the will of all of the Afghan people, and that would allow a concentrated effort against what will be remnant terrorist forces in Afghanistan, not just ISIS Khorasan, but others, whether it's Tehrik-e-Taliban, Pakistan. There's a vegetable soup of militant organizations that have some presence in Afghanistan.
And, and again, I commend State on what is a very difficult negotiation. We all understand the drill here. The Taliban are not very nice people, but sometimes, you have to deal with the world the way it is, and there's not a whole lot of great choices here. Last question, a withdrawal from Afghanistan, what assurances could you give, and you can't predict the future, that this would not result in the Taliban eventually overthrowing the Afghan government, and then we have a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan?
Well, what animates all of our diplomacy is the President and the Secretary's absolute commitment to the security of the American people. And so any peace deal is going to be structured to ensure that Afghanistan cannot and will not reemerge as a threat to America. On the hypotheticals, I don't like answering hypotheticals, but let me put it this way. The Taliban say they want to be a legitimate part of the international community. They argue that they want to attract foreign direct investment. They say they've learned lessons from the isolation that Afghanistan experienced under Taliban rule in the late 1990s and early 2000s. For any Afghan government that includes the Taliban to have those relationships, to attract that foreign direct investment, it's going to have to be a government that upholds standards and values that the international community has been working to instill over the last 18 years. So I think that there's a substantial amount of leverage that the international community will continue to have in the form of assistance monies and in how we engage the Afghan.
And I think that's correct. And the problem, the Taliban, they live in the mountains and the desert, and then you got the palace in Kabul that's U.S.-backed and financed. And I think there's an inherent potential conflict. I think that's a great challenge that I think State Department has. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman.
Ambassador Wells, welcome back. We look forward to seeing you again next month at the Asia Subcommittee for our hearings on human rights in South Asia. And of course, there's considerable interest in my district and a number of others on events in Kashmir. It occurs to me that it's unlikely that we're going to have a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan unless Pakistan wants to see a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is the Durand Line, but no government of Afghanistan has ever accepted that, and including the Taliban and the current government, have all seemed to take in the position that a huge chunk of Pakistan should actually be part of Afghanistan. It seems unlikely that Pakistan is going to be rooting for a peaceful, prosperous Afghanistan if that Afghan government is actively claiming a big chunk of Pakistani territory. First, does the United States accept as inviolate the Durand Line as the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan?
We do recognize the Durand Line as the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
And is there any prospect that we can persuade this Afghan government to, if not permanently accept the line, at least declare that they will not use violence in an effort to change that border?
A great deal of effort, diplomatic effort, has gone into trying to increase the collaboration between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And yesterday, we were very pleased to see Prime Minister Khan open up the Torkham border for 24/7 trade. It's going to be, I think, these practical steps
Yeah,
to increase trade.
I do think we can work toward practical and tactical steps, but I hope that we're also dealing with this festering problem. As long as those Afghan claims are made, and as long as Pakistan can fear that at some future point India and Afghanistan will agree that Pakistan should be, well, I'll move on to the next question. We're supposed to have had a deal, and then the tweet came down and we rejected the deal. Whether or not that was, or at least put the deal on, I believe negotiations are frozen. Since the deal seemed to envision a Camp David visit on 9/11, I'm not, there might be reasons. But I'm trying to understand why this deal was not, or at least as of yet has not been effectuated. And the reason given by the President is that there was one instance in which one American soldier was killed. But at the same time, Secretary Pompeo has said during this same period of time, we have engaged in successful military operations that have killed over 1,000 Taliban fighters. Did we really have a deal with the Taliban that during the 2 or 3, that they wouldn't attack us, but that we would attack them? And their violation of that deal is why we didn't go forward with the agreement?
Both the President and the Secretary have spoken to this, and basically what we saw, the Taliban actions that we saw in the days leading up to a potential agreement on a political framework were inconsistent with the 9 rounds of negotiations that we had held with them. And we saw the Taliban attempting to use violence as a form of intimidation, and they took actions that were basically inconsistent with what ultimately was going to need to be a reduction in violence.
I would point out that killing 1,000 Taliban forces, as Pompeo claims we did, is also a violent action. Finally, there's this idea that they are going to prevent recruiting and fundraising by terrorists in their territory. We have recruiting and fundraising by terrorist organizations here in the United States, where we have an FBI office in every major city. What verification system would we have on the ground in Taliban-controlled areas to see that there wasn't a terrorist presence, wasn't terrorist recruiting, and wasn't terrorist fundraising?
Again, I'm not going to be able to speak to the specifics of what was being negotiated, but very much this was a conditions-based approach, and built into the discussions that Ambassador Khalilzad had with the Taliban.
Are you aware of any verification system that we had at all, or was it trust and don't bother to verify?
This was very much about being able to verify and have confidence that the Taliban had taken the steps they had undertaken to implement.
But you're not aware of any verification systems?
I'm not in a position to discuss the details of what was being discussed.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Mr. Chairman, I got an opening statement I'd like to submit to the record without objection.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Wells, Ms. Freeman, thank you for being here. There's a generation of Americans that have grown up. Actually, they're approaching 20 years of age, and they weren't around when 9/11 happened. And we've been at this conflict, this war, for 19 years, and we know all the expense and the lost lives that can never be replaced. And the person that brings a peace deal to this conflict will win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I appreciate the work you've done. I've got 2 concerns. One is the work and the progress that has been made with the electric grid, the education that's going on, the economy, women going to school and being allowed to go to school. To lose that, in your opinion, do you see if the Taliban gets if we pull out and negotiate with the Taliban, are they going to continue that, or are they going to, go back to where they were with Sharia law?
The Taliban have said that they've learned from some of the mistakes they made in the past, but the Afghanistan that they are going to, the Afghans that they're going to sit across the table from in any negotiation are Afghans who have come of age also with these new freedoms and abilities to contribute to their society, whether it's women, whether it's minorities. And Afghans consistently in polls indicate that they don't want to give up these gains that they've made, the social and political gains that have been made.
Is the
over
Taliban
the last
willing to do
18
that?
years. That's going to have to be negotiated between the two sides. I think what's interesting, are 2 points. One, you see in Taliban-controlled areas that they are under pressure to open girls' schools. In the most conservative areas, there are still no schools, and that can be true in government-controlled areas as well. But there is a demand consistently among Afghans for their daughters now to be educated. I think that's a new reality.
Are
that
those
any
people at the
government-
table that are demanding that?
Absolutely, they will be. I mean, the Afghan negotiators who will sit down across from the Taliban will be bringing these demands, I'm sure, to the table.
All right, and I hope as this winds down that it's understood that radical Islamic terrorists is not accepted anywhere in the world, and especially if they mount attacks that come to America, it'll be met with severe vengeance. As a ranking member of the Asia-Pacific and Nonproliferation Subcommittee, I especially want to bring attention to the growing Chinese influence in Afghanistan via their high-debt, bad terms Belt Road Initiative. And just recently in Reuters, the 16th of this month, China signals veto standoff with the U.S. over Afghanistan because their feelings were hurt because the BRI wasn't brought up. Have the Chinese been in there influencing any of this either way, or are they preventing a settlement?
The Chinese have worked with Ambassador Khalilzad, as have other regional countries, including Russia and then the immediate neighbors, on a way forward on peace. And so there is constructive engagement with China on how do we prosecute peace. But I think it's fair to say that China has not contributed to the economic development of Afghanistan. We've not seen any substantial assistance from China. The Belt and Road is a slogan. It is not any reality. And of course, we continue to warn our partners and would certainly warn the Afghan government about falling prey to predatory loans or loans that are designed to benefit only the Chinese state.
But we know the way the Chinese work. I mean, with the corruption, they'll fall right into that. I mean, it's an easy road for them. And if they haven't contributed to the peace process, if they haven't contributed to the rebuilding of that nation, they should have no say in this. I feel that way. And I hope we stand strong on that because we've seen the effect of what China has done. And, Ms. Freeman, I want to just point out to you that, with what you're doing with USAID and going in there and doing the work you're in a tough neighborhood and making the gains you're doing, I appreciate that. And with the rollout of the BUILD Act in October, our goal is to establish, identify significant infrastructure developments that we can go in, and that we can go in as a trusted partner, that we're going to do something that is best for the Afghan people to build their economy so that we can develop the jobs for them so that we have trading going on. Do you have any thoughts on that, or where we can look at?
Thank you, sir. First of all, let me just echo some of Ambassador Wells' thoughts on going forward. I think it's important to note that over the last 18 years, the change in Afghanistan has been so great in terms of the laws, education, the development of a very active, a very vocal private sector, the increases in trade, the strengthening of civil society, and it's created a reflective demand in areas that can see what's happened. In terms of infrastructure, we continue to work with the government of Afghanistan to strengthen their ability to develop the infrastructure. So I think what you'll be seeing in terms of the core of USAID's program there is to involve the government and involve the private sector.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there just because I'm out of time, and thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Mr. Sires.
Well, good morning, and thank you for being here, Ambassador and Ms. Freeman. Yeah, my district that I represent is across from the World Trade Center. And for months, we watched the plume of smoke and so forth. And it was beyond me what the thought process was to invite the Taliban to come to Camp David. Can you tell me what I mean, it was so insensitive and so, sensitive is mild for some of the people in my district. What was the thought behind that?
Both the president, or I think the president himself, has spoken openly about his thought process on the Camp David invitation. I would just underscore, it again shows that this is an administration that's willing to take risks to try to promote peace. But I appreciate your concerns.
Yeah, but I have to say, inviting the Taliban to Camp David, I mean, that's a little bit too much to swallow. It was almost days before the towers came down. So to me, I hope that this idea is dead, and you bring that back and say that many people not only thought it was insensitive, but it's just not appropriate to bring the Taliban to America, to Camp David, to do a negotiation. There are many places in the world that you can meet to negotiate. So I hope that thought is dead of bringing these people to America. I keep reading that the Taliban has been very vocal about refusing to engage with the Afghan government, and previous attempts at intra-Afghan talks have failed. So how are we going to be able to come to any kind of a peace if these people don't talk to each other? What are the prospects of peace? What are the prospects of them talking to each other if they keep being so vocal about it?
The goal of the last round of our series of negotiations was designed to bring Afghans together to a negotiating table. And the conversations that we were having with the Taliban were the prelude to conversations that the Taliban would have with a pan-Afghan national negotiating team that would include members of the government. There was initial progress in that the informal dialogue that took place in Qatar in July did include members of the Afghan government as part of the delegation meeting with the Taliban. So again, I think we've broken new ground as a result of this last series of negotiations that took place.
Then why might some incentives be to the Taliban to engage in good faith dialogue with the Afghan government? What can we offer them? What incentives could we give the Taliban?
I don't think we need to talk about incentives. I think we need to talk about what are mutual interests. And there are, the Taliban have an interest, in being able to participate legitimately in a government that's recognized by the international community and to avoid the costs of war. I think the Taliban appreciate, based on what they've said publicly, that there is a cost to Afghanistan's development by the ongoing war, and they also see, frankly, the rise of other terrorist groups who pose a threat to themselves and to the future of Afghanistan. If you look at a group like ISIS-Khorasan, I mean, that is a terrorist group that doesn't recognize Afghanistan as a nation state. This is a group that focuses on caliphate and borderless territory under the organization's control. That's a deep threat to all people of Afghanistan, including the Taliban.
Are the Taliban stronger now than they were in 2001, militarily?
Well, in 2001, the Taliban controlled the entire country, so no. The Taliban do not control any provincial capital. They do not rule in any province of Afghanistan. When they fight, they fight, and then they have to leave because they cannot sustain control over the district centers or the provincial centers. And so, the Taliban are very good at public diplomacy and messaging, but they are by no means, controlling Afghanistan. And I hesitate to get involved in the statistics on control of territory because they can be very misleading. If you look at all of the urban centers of Afghanistan where a majority of the population now reside, this is under government control and benefiting from the investments and development of the last 18 years.
My time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sears. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and really do thank you both for being here, and it means a lot that you're willing to take the time and talk about this tough issues. I think, first off, we need a bit of a reset in the narrative from the Rand Paul endless wars narrative that we hear, and look at where we're really at. First off, I do want to say, though, I think the Camp David, I'm going to add myself to the record of the Camp David meeting was an utter disaster and never should have happened, infuriated me, and I think even people that wanted to get out of Afghanistan, it ticked them off too. And I have no clue how that could have gone through any kind of filter, not just of ideas, but how we actually got to where it was going to frickin' happen. So I hope that never happens again. No terrorist should be allowed on the United States unless they're in chains, and especially a terrorist that attacked the U.S. on 9/11, harbored the terrorists, and especially on the anniversary of 9/11. So I got that out. I do want to say, though, that I think the thing we have to keep in mind is this fight that we're fighting in terrorism is a generational battle. It took us decades to basically overthrow the Soviet Union, and that wasn't through fighting. This is a low-grade war version of that. But it took that second, third generation of people behind the Iron Curtains to make the decision that they didn't want to live like that. And that's what overthrew and tore down the Iron Curtain. I think the same thing is going to happen in this battle. It's going to be fighting terrorists where they exist, but also, and this is where USAID and some of those initiatives come in especially important, giving hope and opportunity to a new generation of people so that they can see that there is an opportunity for a life outside of radicalization, that you can live past the age of 15 when they strap a suicide bomb to you and tell you to walk into a crowded cafe or something like that. Bringing hope and opportunity, it's how you're going to fix this gang situation in the United States, and it's how you prevent people from recruiting terrorists. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind, is this battle that we're fighting, though we'd all love to be over with it, isn't our choice. This isn't our decision. We're not the ones that decided to radicalize and kill innocent people. Instead, we're the ones that reacted, and we reacted in a pretty fierce and intense way. And we need to understand that, because I think if we leave Afghanistan under the wrong conditions, which I think, frighteningly, we're actually on track to do, we're going to be back here anyway. And we talk about how this is the first time a kid is fighting the same war as his dad. I agree, but we're going to have a grandkid fighting the same war as his grandpa if we leave Afghanistan in a bad situation, because they ain't going to quit trying to come here. And the reason we're not thinking about terrorism as much as we have in the past is because we're being successful in fighting it. We're fighting it over there. They're not able to train and recruit here as much as they used to be able to, and we're keeping them on the defensive. So, Ambassador Wells, I have to ask you just a couple of quick questions. We killed 1,000 Taliban. It may be 100, maybe 1,000, maybe 1 million. I don't know what it is, but we did kill some Taliban after we pulled out of these negotiations. The question I have is, does that mean we weren't targeting Taliban at all, and we were allowing them to regroup and retrain until this moment, or have we been prosecuting that fight anyway? Because I would think if we had a Taliban target, we'd probably want to take it out.
We absolutely have been fighting and talking our way through the negotiations. And the only distinction I would make, Congressman, is that I think we and the Afghan government and people distinguish between a Pashtun nationalist insurgency and a group like ISIS. And so the ability to try to prosecute a peace settlement is to hive off that insurgency so that the consolidated Afghan government can focus on what is truly the generational threat to all of us, an organization like ISIS Khorasan.
Thank you, but I also think Taliban's a threat, but I understand your point. But, I think, frankly, if we want a favorable negotiation, this is above your pay grade, but I'll say it, if we want a favorable negotiation, you do that through prosecuting a war against the Taliban and saying we're willing to have peace, but until we do, it's going to be painful. And you know what? Your kids and your grandkids may have to fight this, but hopefully we can get to a peace settlement. The other question I have, you know what? I'm just going to make it as a statement. I'm concerned that the president's statements, since he was a candidate and since he's been in office, repeatedly declaring his desire to get out of Afghanistan, calling this basically a dumb war, whatever he's used, which, by the way, is brand new. This used to be a very bipartisan agreement on this fight. is only emboldening the Taliban in the discussion. When you see the man making the call claiming he wants to leave, it's hard to give up a lot when you know that that's the end goal. It was the same reason I was critical of the Iran nuclear deal, quite honestly, because I thought the administration made too many statements about their desire to get to the end. I want to say thank you to both of you for your good work and being here. Thanks for your service to your country. And, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Bearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to reiterate what my colleague from Illinois just said. Ambassador Wells, Ms. Freeman, thank you for your service, and thank you to the service of our diplomats and our aid and development workers around the world every day representing the United States. Obviously, this is a very complicated region, and with the blood and monetary investments that we've made over the last 18 years in the region, we want to give Afghanistan the best possibility of success, and it's not going to be easy. So I commend both of you and the negotiators to try to find that path forward. And obviously, we've got a fatigued American public as well as a fatigued military that will always do the mission, but also wants to come home. Knowing that and knowing we want to give Afghanistan the best chance of success, I'd like to focus on some of the countries within the region, notably India and Pakistan. Again, two countries that aren't having the best relationship right now, but both that are going to be vitally important to Afghanistan's success. Perhaps Ambassador Wells, we see the tensions in Kashmir right now. You hear conversations from the Indians at times with some concern that America's desire to get a deal done in Afghanistan potentially, has them negotiating with Pakistan, and Kashmir is part of that. Do you see any evidence of that, and do you, just from your perspective?
What we see are two countries, India and Pakistan, that both have national security interests in Afghanistan. And both countries will benefit by an Afghanistan that is truly at peace and stable. I think the principle that has to undergird relations between all the countries in the region is the respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, that no militant proxies, no non-state actors are acceptable. And being used as a lever of influence or pressure against another. And so in our diplomacy to the region, that undergirds our approach. How do we have the region all reap the benefits of peace? If you look at, for instance, Afghanistan being a blocking point now between the flow of trade, including energy. Energy is 10 times more expensive in South Asia than it is in Central Asia, but you can't get it there, because of the instability in Afghanistan. So how do we frame an outcome, where everybody palpably benefits by being able to create stable and enduring, political structures? And so I think that there is a conversation that absolutely all countries in the region, need to have, and that certainly has guided Ambassador Khalilzad's approach as he has built out his conversations on peace with the regional actors.
So as we kind of take that multilateral approach, again, complicated region, I would agree with you that you do need the players in that region who are close to Afghanistan to be sitting at the table, helping negotiate that peace deal. Obviously, as we start to withdraw, with that comes a lot of resources that we've dedicated to, and there are few countries in the region that, India's dedicated billions of dollars to construction and investment. The hope would be that China, in a responsible way, potentially helps out there as well. Again, very complicated as we move forward here. Ms. Freeman, from the USAID perspective, obviously we've made investments in Afghanistan as well, trying to educate girls, and trying to give them the best chance of success. What would you say, our focus ought to be, again, working with the other countries in that region as well?
I think that one of the shifts that we saw in our most recent strategic review has been one that really focuses much more on the private sector, much more on exchange, and really looking at the realistic flow throughout the region, be that the strengthening of the electrical grid that connects the region, or extending trade throughout the region. We've had a number of highly successful, in fact, there is another one coming up next week, trade fairs in which we engage the Indians and others in the region. We've helped the government of Afghanistan to strengthen its air corridors so that it can trade more rapidly within the region. So that connectivity really does follow trade, and we've worked very hard to increase the ease of that trade and the ease of the negotiation within the region.
Well, again, thank you for both of you for your service, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Berra. Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you for the witnesses for both being here. First off, with regards to the Camp David meeting, echoing sentiment that I've heard from colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I certainly share it myself. I'm glad that the meeting with the Taliban at Camp David was canceled. I believe that that should not have been scheduled in the first place, and I would not want to see the Taliban back at Camp David in the future, especially on the anniversary of September 11th, 2001. Now, this isn't simple. If this was all simple, this would have been resolved a long time ago. On September 11th, 2001, al-Qaeda terrorists murdered thousands of innocent Americans, and countless first responders have died since because of exposure to toxic chemicals at Ground Zero in the days, the weeks, the months that followed September 11th, 2001. Our decision to go to Afghanistan was correct and legitimate. I'm glad that we made that decision when we did, to deliver justice, to defend America. It's been at great cost here in our own country. Justice has been delivered overseas. Osama bin Laden is dead. There are many others who have followed his fate. There is great cost, the greatest cost, at attacking U.S. interests, as we saw on September 11, 2001. So while we mourn the loss of life here in the United States, what should not go unnoticed for our adversaries abroad is the unlimited amount of resolve and will of our country to deliver justice to anyone who seeks that harm to us. There are terrorists there, terrorist groups who are in and around Afghanistan who would like to continue to kill Americans. They would like to continue to target U.S. interests. And here we are. It's 18 years later. Many in the United States want to end the war in Afghanistan. Quite frankly, every American should want to end any war, whether it's in Afghanistan or anywhere. We should not want war in the first place. But as I said, in Afghanistan, our decision to go in was correct and legitimate. The Taliban wants us out. I want to be able to ask you a question with regards to what the Afghanistan government wants and how we deal with it. I think it's naive to think that we just leave Afghanistan today and everything just works itself out on its own. I believe strongly that the vacuum is not successfully filled at this moment by good people in Afghanistan government, not right now. So how do we get to the result that we want? This morning, this committee met with Ambassador Khalilzad. I thought it was a good meeting. We're not allowed to get into it because it was a classified briefing. I'll just say I believe that it was very helpful for that meeting to take place. I believe that that should happen again. I believe that we should be spending more time together. It's good for us here on this committee to hear from him in that setting, and I also think it's good for the State Department to hear from us, to get fresh eyes, to get other perspectives. And that brings me back to my question. In our time left in an unclassified setting, can you speak to where we're at with the Afghanistan government, what they desire as far as an American presence, and how do we get the Afghanistan government in a place where we can leave and the good guys in Afghanistan's government fill that vacuum so that we are in a position to leave?
I think the critical point is that we don't want to leave or abandon Afghanistan at all. I mean, what we want is to have a sustainable, enduring partnership with Afghanistan. Currently, with this Afghan government, we have a bilateral security arrangement. We have a myriad of MOUs that bind us together as partners and allies. And I think the Afghan government very much wants to see that partnership with the American people and the American private sector and the American government to continue. Our provision of support, right now we provide about 80% of support for the security sector, is absolutely essential. So I think we have to build confidence that in Afghans, as they sit down at a table with the Taliban, that the international community is not looking to run away. And so today, for instance, in London, there is a meeting of donors to discuss, what would we do in the event of a peace treaty? How do we respond to peace? How do we create economic programs that will help a new Afghanistan government get on its feet and succeed, as a nation state? And so through doing this kind of an organization, through engaging the Afghan government and ultimately the Taliban, I think we need to signal very clearly that the objective is not to walk away.
I appreciate that answer, Ambassador Wells. Specifically with regards to military presence, I think it's important to note that the days of the United States military having the amount of numbers that we have now is not one that we want to be continuing indefinitely. So that was specifically what I was getting at. Very much appreciate your answer and for being here. I thank the chair for hosting today's hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Ciccolini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Ambassador Wells, what is the current state of the relationship between the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and what, if anything, did the Taliban agree to with respect to that relationship in this framework, if they did?
The Taliban have never repudiated their relationship with al-Qaeda. And so that's the fundamental crux of the issue. And in what has been said publicly about the conversations and negotiations that have taken place with the Taliban is that in this conditions-based, framework, we were looking to the Taliban to cut off all sanctuary, the ability of any al-Qaeda members to reside there, to recruit there, to fundraise there, to operate. And so it was a complete commitment to eliminate ties and presence of al-Qaeda.
And with respect to terrorism broadly, is there a framework about the commitments that the Taliban makes with respect to terrorism in this proposal?
I can't, it's not for me, and certainly not in this setting, to go into the details of what was negotiated. I wasn't part of the negotiating team. But what animates the approach of the administration is that the peace agreement must be founded on the principle that American security is not imperiled. That we continue to ensure that Afghanistan not become a platform, that we have confidence that Afghanistan's not going to become a platform. So I can assure you that these concerns are at the very top of the negotiating agenda, as was evidenced over the last 9 rounds of talks.
And Ambassador Wells, what mechanisms will be available to the United States if it draws down its military presence and the Taliban fails to live up to the commitments it makes? Are we working with international partners who are interested in supporting the Taliban's, or ensuring that the Taliban meets its obligations? Or what's the enforcement mechanism? Because how do we avoid getting back into the situation where they make a commitment, it doesn't happen, and we're back again to some suggestion that we need to increase military engagement in a place we've been for 18 years?
Again, I can't prejudge what a peace agreement would produce, but I'll just cite the Secretary's comments on this, and that is, we have a very powerful and capable military, and we're confident that we're able to prosecute and protect our interests.
But my question really is, what mechanisms do we have to ensure that the Taliban complies with an agreement that we may reach with them?
I can't prejudge, what will come out of and what will be finally negotiated in a political framework agreement.
Okay. Do you think it's important that the agreement be reached between the Afghan government and the Taliban prior to any decision on a withdrawal by U.S. military personnel? And what are the risks if our troop withdrawal precedes that, or precedes even a countrywide ceasefire?
All I can say is that publicly we have underscored the expectation that an intra-Afghan dialogue would be undertaken in good faith and quickly.
And finally, Ambassador Wells, how should the United States and our international partners enforce any Taliban commitments on human rights, of course, particularly with respect to the progress for minorities, women, and girls? I mean, do we have, what is your view on how we can most effectively enforce commitments that are made, and what is the role of our partners in the international community? This is an area of deep concern, I think, to many members of this committee.
I think it's very important that donors speak with one voice about the importance we attach to the values enshrined in the Constitution, in particular respect for the rights of women and girls to education, to work outside the home, protection for minorities. And again, today in London, there'll be a meeting of donors where one of the central goals is just to underscore this common commitment that we have. So if the Taliban wants to be, or if a government that includes the Taliban wants to be a legitimate member of the international community, that's going to be the expectation of the international community.
And are there women engaged in the actual negotiations that have been underway, actually at the negotiating table? So in addition to issues related to women and girls, are there women who are participating in this process?
At the intra-Afghan talks that took place in Doha, 25% of the non-Taliban participants were women. Women are members of the High Peace Council in Afghanistan. President Ghani has given public assurances that, of his intent to have Afghan women on any pan-Afghan negotiating team. Afghan women are certainly a critical audience for us as we engage with stakeholders across Afghanistan to both explain our approach and to understand their concerns.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your attendance today. Seems to me that the enemy is not leaving anytime soon, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban elements, Haqqani, you name it, they're all either operating, increasing operations, or waiting to fill the vacuum. And we don't certainly want to abandon the Afghan people or our very, very significant investment in the stability and peace in Afghanistan. That having been said, I just wonder, I think you said that we're providing 80%, is that right? 80% of the strong support, in the strong support role for Afghan security forces?
That's right, and 25% of economic and humanitarian assistance.
Based on that, it just seems, when will they be able to sustain themselves? I mean, I think, look, America and Americans, I think, are rightly weary of the treasure, both in lives, and that continues, and economically, that Afghanistan has cost our country with, I would say, I think in a lot of people's minds, marginal results. For so long, a slog here, and we're trying to figure out, I think, as many American citizens, how much longer will it be? And it almost seems like, I know they're trying to develop capability, but they have an incentive to not develop capability as long as we're willing to be there at 80%, and it's got to come down, and they're going to have to take on more of the role. And quite honestly, some of the neighbors in the area that have a vested interest in Afghanistan's safety and security have got to take a bigger role. Will the Afghan government, as far as you know, allow American basing as a part of any negotiated deal and settlement that has a diminution of activity or forces in strong support of security forces over the long haul? Will they allow us to stay in some regard?
We can't know or predict what's going to come out of a negotiation between Afghans and the Taliban. What I would
I'm talking about the Afghan government and the United States, the negotiations between the United States. I know the Taliban doesn't want us there. That's part of the problem. But
Well, with the Afghan government, we do have a bilateral security arrangement. We reside on Afghanistan bases. We have a military presence on Afghanistan bases, and very much, our support for the Afghan government is premised on Afghanistan sovereignty. But I agree, sir, and the President and the Secretary have spoken forcefully about the $30 billion or so a year that we spend to maintain the operations in Afghanistan. So we're looking to reduce those numbers by trying to rationalize our presence and our approach to the battle in Afghanistan. We've actively and successfully increased the amount of burden sharing by our donors, and I think if you point to the economic section, that's very much.
I don't mean to interrupt you, ma'am. I think I just want to make sure that we consider Japan and Germany sovereign nations, but we're afforded basing in those countries over the long term, and it seems to me that Afghanistan should be in the same position, but they need to secure their own country, their own sovereign nation, and not depend on an 80% solution set from the United States in that regard. Because of the neighborhood that Afghanistan resides in, I've been to Kabul. It looks indefensible to me as a military guy, and I wonder if you can assess if we're going to remain in Afghanistan for America's interests, even if it might not be for the sake of the security forces of Afghanistan and supporting them at 80% or anything close to that, but we're going to remain for our own national interests and national security interests so that we can operate in Afghanistan as necessary when Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Khorasan, whoever pops their head up. What is the best defensible position geographically that we can also sustain? Understand that Pakistan's on one side, you got China up there, you got Iran around the southern and western side. Is it Tajikistan? Is it on the border with Uzbekistan? If we were going to remain there indefinitely, like we have in Germany and Japan, for our own national security, what is the best geographic location in your assessment to do that?
We're not looking for permanent basing in Afghanistan, and to the contrary, we would like to be able to create the conditions for our troops to come home. But in the absence of the conditions allowing that, if there continues to be
the enemy's going to remain, as you know.
If you posit that the enemy is going to remain, certainly we would welcome the opportunity to have a counterterrorism relationship with whatever government emerges in Afghanistan. I can't predict or conclude what's going to be the case at the end of a negotiation. But when it comes to the 80,000 figure, I would just add, I think everyone agrees, including Afghan officials, that the size of the Afghan army now is not sustainable. It's a function of the war that's being fought in partnership with us. But a sustainable Afghanistan, an Afghan government that can support its own economic development and support its own security forces would look very different.
My time's expired. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just kind of surprised to hear you, Ambassador, say Belt and Road is a slogan, not a reality. We've been hearing an awful lot about the reality of infrastructure projects across Africa, ports ranging from Sri Lanka to Lima. I think it is more than a slogan. Second, I appreciate Mr. Cicilline bringing up the point about women. I don't think I share your optimism that we can trust the Taliban to negotiate in good faith with the Afghan government and protect the gains that have been made by women over the last 18 years, because they're really not at the table and they're not part of the negotiating process. But what I want to ask you about is something we hadn't talked about, and that's the poppy trade. Opium poppies are Afghan's most valuable cash crop. They brought in $863 million last year. Afghanistan's the largest global producer. It accounts for 82% of the world's production. We know how many lives have been lost as a result of being addicted to heroin. Afghanistan's production reached record highs over the last 2 years, except for a small dip because of the drought. And all our efforts over there have been unsuccessful. The Special Inspector General found that our alternative development programs were too short. They didn't bring about lasting reductions in the cultivation. Sometimes they contributed to increased production. The DOD also ended a military counter-narcotics campaign in 2017 that failed to yield results. Could you talk about how this played into the negotiation? What are our efforts now? What do they plan to be? Was poppy cultivation part of the conversation at all? And why was this so unsuccessful?
Quickly, just to clarify, Belt and Road is very real, but in Afghanistan, it's a slogan. The Chinese simply haven't put money. They've just tried to lock down lucrative mining contracts, but not follow through with investment or real resources. We share your concern on poppy, how it's criminalized the economy, the expanding role of opium production in undermining governance and transparency. It is fundamentally, though, I think an issue that is tied to security. If 80 to 85% of opium in Afghanistan is produced in areas that are controlled or under the contested or influenced by the Taliban,
right.
That's been what has, I think, prevented the much more sustainable approaches to eliminating opium production, including alternative livelihoods, crops, high-value crops that are more valuable than opium. Where we've had some success is in establishing some of the structures, the laws, the regulatory structures, the special police units, whether it's the under the counter-narcotics police, we have a sensitive investigation unit and the National Interdiction Unit. They're doing real seizures. But this is in the context of something that really fundamentally has to come out of an improved security environment that we don't have right now.
Was this part of any of the negotiation with the Taliban? And this is their main source of revenue. What we're going to do about that in the future, or we're just going to turn a blind eye to it?
I can't speak to what was said during the course of the negotiations, but the Taliban have been very public about saying and pointing to their past record of having eliminated opium production. And so
But we know that's not true.
They, for complex reasons that immediately right before their downfall, they did issue a fatwa against opium production that effectively reduced opium production in the areas that they controlled. We would welcome the Taliban issuing a fatwa today saying that opium production should be banned in the areas that they control, which they've not done. So, this is all very cynical, but I don't want to suggest that it's only a Taliban problem. Drug money in Afghanistan is everywhere. It permeates everywhere. It criminalizes the broader economy. It is a distorting factor, in Afghanistan's ability to develop as a self-sustaining nation.
You want to speak to that from your point of view?
Well, from a development point of view, one of the alternatives is to look at creating a reflection. And what USAID has sought to do is to create improved markets, improved access, look at value chains, try to extend from out into the rural areas an ability to produce legitimate crops and get those to market in a timely fashion.
Has that been successful?
That has been very successful. Whether
How do
it's
you
drawing
measure that
away
success?
from
How do you
whether
measure that
whether it's
success?
drawing away from the opium trade, that I can't tell you. In terms of improving livelihoods and improving people's incomes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Titus. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador Wells and Ms. Freeman, for being here. None of my comments or questions are meant in any way to criticize your dedicated and lengthy public service. We have had bipartisan failure in Afghanistan for over 18 years across administrations. The Trump administration is continuing that failure. I understand you're simply executing orders of the president, but I do want to get some facts out here to the American people. Ms. Wells, approximately how many U.S. service members and U.S. civilians have died in the Afghan war?
About 2,400.
Okay. With civilians, it's over 4,000. Is that correct?
I actually don't have that statistic, but I take your data.
About how many U.S. service members have been wounded in the Afghan war?
Is it 26,000, sir?
Yes, so correct. Over 20,000 at least. How many U.S. troops are currently in Afghanistan?
Around 14,000?
Okay. In 2016, before Donald Trump took office, how many U.S. troops were in Afghanistan?
8,600 or 8,400?
So Donald Trump ran on a campaign of getting the U.S. out of endless wars, of getting us out of dumb wars in the Middle East. He has failed to deliver on that promise. In fact, he has increased troops in Afghanistan by approximately 70%. Do you know the cost of how much the U.S. has spent in Afghanistan, Ms. Wells?
I don't have an exact figure. I
It's-
don't think
Sure.
we've been able to produce an exact figure. We talk about $30 billion a year total in Afghanistan
Thank
now.
you. So according to the Washington Post, it's been over $1 trillion. There's an article in the Washington Post saying Trump's Afghanistan troop increase adds to $1 trillion in war costs, and we have very little to show for this. We are still in a stalemate. There's no indication if we stay another 18 years that we're going to achieve any sort of victory. In fact, what ends up happening is because we keep killing civilians and other folks in Afghanistan, it makes terrorist recruiting that much easier. So I want to ask you about a Reuters article that came out today documenting that yesterday a U.S. drone strike in Afghanistan killed at least 30 civilian farmers. Are you aware of that drone strike?
I've seen press reports that an Afghanistan strike may have produced civilian casualties. That's being investigated and looked into by Resolute Support Mission. If true, it would be very tragic. I would note that, again, the civilian attacks or civilian casualties are made happen more easily because of the fact that ISIS and Taliban immerse themselves in the civilian population, don't distinguish how they dress, and themselves directly target civilians.
Thank you for that. We do have complete air superiority in Afghanistan, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And our drones can linger over a target for a fair amount of time, correct?
Sir, I don't know whether the report that you're mentioning is a drone attack. The reports I've seen have suggested this was something that was, I don't know the details of the incident, so I don't want to comment on it.
Sure. When I served on active duty in the U.S. military, one of the things I did is I briefed commanders on the law of armed conflict. As you know, intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. It is also a war crime if it's a disproportionate use of force. So if you were to think that there may be 1 or 2 terrorists there and you're going to end up killing 30 civilians, you can't launch that strike either. So I look forward to administration providing us information as to if in fact this strike killed at least 30 civilians, what the purpose of that strike was, and how does this happen when we have complete air superiority and our air assets can linger over targets for a fair amount of time. And all of this does bring me to how do we now conclude our failure in Afghanistan. So when is the next meeting that the administration is going to have with the Taliban? Has that been scheduled?
No, the talks are paused at this stage.
Right. So not only
Excuse me,
have
suspended.
we now had over 4,000 U.S. service members, civilians killed in Afghanistan, by your estimate, 26,000 service members wounded, over $1 trillion spent on this war in Afghanistan. We are in a stalemate, and the administration has now zero strategy, zero scheduled talks, no ability to get us out of this quagmire. It is time to bring our troops home. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Is Ms. Wild here? Ms. Wild.
I have questions for each of you. I only have 5 minutes, as you know. I'm going to be a little quick and just ask that you be circumspect in your answers. Ms. Freeman, to start, the United States has invested an enormous amount of human life, money, and time into the conflict and attempted peace-building process in Afghanistan, as we all know. Since 2002, Congress has appropriated more than $132 billion in aid for Afghanistan. More than 2,000 U.S. troops have lost their lives in Afghanistan, and currently we have 14,000 troops there. My question to you is this: how is the Trump administration working to ensure that the investments the U.S. has made in Afghanistan, like building hospitals, schools, supporting NGOs, and advancing women's rights, is not lost if we withdraw from the country? And I ask that in the context of this, particularly because the Trump administration has not included the Afghan government in peace negotiations. How are we making sure that the progress we've made in Afghanistan will be maintained long term?
Thank you. I think that the most succinct answer to your question is the broad programming of sustainability and working on systems, which I was trying to highlight in my own testimony. It's not a matter of just the number of students that are trained, but it's the infrastructure that is built. That infrastructure may be physical or it may be institutional, and strengthening the systems within the government. And I think we have a great deal of success to be shown in terms of strengthening internal systems to advance Afghanistan's own ownership of its development. The other area that I would point to in terms of sustainability is the development of stronger voices in Afghanistan to sustain themselves going forward. The voices of women, the voices of the private sector, the voices of educators that will carry forward through time in terms of their expectations.
Thank you. I'm deeply concerned, and I appreciate your response, and I think it's a good one, but I hope we don't negate the progress that we've helped build in that country and the sacrifices, particularly that our troops have made by pulling out with a plan in place to create and sustain lasting peace. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Wells. And my question to you is this: we know that in July 2018, in an unprecedented move, the Trump administration entered into direct high-level negotiations with the Taliban and without Afghan government representatives. And in doing so, the administration reversed longstanding U.S. position that any peace process would have to be Afghan-owned and Afghan-led. And this, of course, harkens back to the questions that I was asking Ms. Freeman. For close to a year, the administration held almost continuous meetings with Taliban representatives. And I'm not going to go through what happened on September 11th because some of my colleagues have, and we all know. But we know also that for decades, the Taliban have carried out violence against women and egregiously violated women's human rights. Afghanistan is ranked the worst place in the world to be a woman. 87% of their women are illiterate, 70 to 80% of them are in forced marriages, and 90% have experienced domestic abuse. So, you know, our president loves to refer to himself as a great negotiator and a great deal maker, but we haven't seen any successful deals on behalf of the American people yet. And I'm wondering, my question to you is this: when the Trump administration engages in high-level talks for almost a year with the Taliban and without the Afghan government, how do we expect these negotiations to ultimately be successful and bring long-term peace?
Congresswoman, I think it's a mischaracterization. We're in constant contact and constant engagement with the government of Afghanistan. We were working in parallel tracks as we discussed issues with the Taliban. We were discussing the same issues with the Afghan government and coming up with an agreed-upon approach, under this political framework. Ambassador Bass is there every day. General Miller is there every day. Ambassador Khalilzad has spent more weeks in Afghanistan over the last 8 or 9 months than I can calculate. And so we're very committed because the outcome of this initial set of conversations was to get to an intra-Afghan dialogue, a negotiation, was to get the Afghans to sit down at the table, which the Taliban have refused to do over the last 18 years. And we started to see that break down with the intra-Afghan discussion that took place in Doha in July. So this was not about ignoring the government of Afghanistan, freezing it out of negotiations. To the contrary, it was creating, the preconditions that would allow Afghans finally to sit down and begin to find the appropriate compromises to move forward to a unified government in peace.
Thank you. My time is up. I just reiterate, I hope we do not lose the progress that has been made by excluding important parties.
Thank you, Ms. Weil. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to speak. Given that the Pakistani inter-service intelligence has long given support to the Taliban, is there a role that Pakistan must play in the negotiations with the Taliban? And if so, would Prime Minister Khan have trouble getting the Pakistani military to help?
Pakistan does have a very important role in ensuring that negotiations both take place and are successful. And we've seen constructive support by Pakistan in helping to ensure that there was an authoritative negotiating team. Pakistan released Mullah Baradar from prison where they were holding him, and he then took over leadership of the Taliban negotiating group. We've been working closely with Pakistan, and Ambassador Khalilzad's consultations very much include and are based on the expectation that Pakistan will provide this support. Prime Minister Khan publicly has been forward-leaning in his support for peace in Afghanistan. We appreciate the steps that he's taken and members of his government have taken to try to improve relations with Afghanistan, because improved Afghanistan-Pakistan relations are also going to be critical to a sustainable peace. But this is an area where we will continue to have expectations and asks of Pakistan.
Thank you, ma'am. In the 90s, the Taliban, I believe they said that bin Laden and al-Qaeda were not a threat to the U.S. How can we trust them now when they say that they will not allow foreign terrorist organizations on Afghan soil?
There's no intention to trust, and I think any peace agreement or any negotiations with the Taliban will be conditions-based, and the United States will have to have confidence that our security will not be imperiled.
Say that again about trust. What was the wording?
The agreement can't be based on trust. It has to be conditions-based, and where we have confidence through verification, through means that our security is not being eroded as a result of a peace agreement.
So it's not really trust but verify. It's not really trust but verify.
Verify.
Yes, Ms. Verify. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Given all the uncertainty with the Taliban negotiations, should the Afghan presidential elections still be held or postponed?
The Afghan elections are proceeding on September 28th. We've long argued that the government of Afghanistan and the electoral bodies need to do everything possible to ensure that they are transparent and credible to the Afghan people. The United States has provided support for the elections through funding of the UN mission in Afghanistan. We've also provided technical assistance through USAID in developing protocols. I think certain steps have been taken that could improve some of the technical aspects of the elections this time around, including polling center-based registration lists, which will make it less possible for industrial fraud. But at the same time, you have fewer polling stations that will be opening in this election compared to 2014. And certainly the Afghanistan electoral institutions are going to have to be able to respond to Afghans' concerns over the misuse of government resources and other efforts to influence elections.
Okay. What are some ways to incentivize the direct Taliban-Afghan government talks?
I think that both sides have an interest in peace, and what's remarkable is, despite the incredible violence and just indiscriminate violence against civilians that has been inflicted by the Taliban, the Afghan people remain committed to trying to find a way forward and remain committed to a peace negotiation. Because as long as Afghanistan is racked by violence, you can't achieve the security to create a normal state that's self-sustaining. And, the Taliban, their interests, as I said before, I think are motivated by a desire to be seen as legitimate, to be able to engage on, in a way that they have not with the international community, to participate in a functioning government and in a country that is economically more prosperous.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Let's see. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you to the chair. Thank you to our witnesses today. Ambassador Wells, I'd like to start with a question for you. After 18 years of U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan, the country stands in a bloody stalemate. Thousands of American service members have lost their lives, talks with the Taliban have broken down, and the American public is war-weary. As reconciliation and security efforts advance, I am particularly concerned that Afghanistan will again be used by international terrorist groups such as al-Qaeda or Islamic State Khorasan to launch and plan attacks on the United States or our allies. As you've already discussed, if the previous rounds of talks had continued as planned, the Taliban was going to agree to preventing terrorist groups from using Afghanistan to plan and launch attacks. Yet it is not clear that the Taliban would follow through on this pledge or even have the ability to rein in the numerous terrorist organizations. They have made and failed to keep similar pledges before. And so my question is, what do you see as a realistic path forward to ensuring that Afghanistan is not ripe for terrorist groups to plan and launch cross-border terrorist attacks? And how can we proceed with enforcing any agreement related to that type of promise?
Again, I would say, I think it's a bit of a mischaracterization to say that it's only been a bloody stalemate. I mean, we have a situation now where the Afghans are doing the overwhelming majority of the fighting. We have a situation where the Taliban don't control provincial capitals. They're not in control of the country or in control of the people. We have a situation where we have succeeded in ensuring that Afghanistan has not been used as a platform against us again. And so the baseline goal and reason why we went into Afghanistan, I think we've upheld. America's security is going to be the foremost objective of any peace negotiation that we support. And the president has spoken to that, the secretary has spoken to that, and that is why any peace agreement needs to be conditions-based. I can't give specifics now, and I would leave it to further briefings. If and when a peace negotiation resumes. But I think that the Afghan people, the Taliban, and we agree that this is not a conflict that is going to be won militarily. So the question of how we get back to a sustainable peace process is one that is under active review by the administration.
And how much do you think the fact that Afghanistan hasn't been used as a platform to launch additional attacks against us or U.S. interests outside of Afghanistan, how much do you think that is a result of the presence of our forces? My question being specifically, if we were to move towards removing U.S. forces, how does that significantly change the dynamic that has allowed us to achieve some of the stability that you just discussed?
In the context of an active war against the Taliban, the presence of American and international forces has been critical.
Okay, and so then in thinking through the type of agreement that we could make with the Taliban and looking at what sort of enforcement would be possible, what do you see as potential levers for negotiation or potential successes for the type of enforcement that would allow us to ensure that Afghanistan cannot devolve into a place where terrorist networks are able to find safe haven again and potentially plot against the United States?
I think, as has been said publicly, in a conditions-based agreement, what the Taliban want is the removal of forces, and to be able to achieve a removal of forces, there would have to be confidence on our part that the undertakings were being upheld by the Taliban and its members. You know, I can't hypothesize about what may or may not come out of a future agreement and what specific measures will be included, but I would just go back to the basic point. You know, the United States has the most capable and powerful military in the world. We're committed to protecting our citizens' interests. You know, we are not without options.
The challenge that I see, though, related to the conditions-based discussions is if the Taliban want U.S. departure from Afghanistan, then what is the next step that we take when, in fact, they are not complying with negotiated terms? As you see it, what would be our response if we have, in fact, removed forces? Where do we go from there?
I can't hypothesize about that scenario.
Thank you for your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Spanberg. And Mr. Levin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. According to the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, there were more civilian casualties in 2018 than in any other year since they began counting. And it was also reported that for the first time since the United Nations began documenting civilian casualties in Afghanistan, more civilians were killed by Afghan government and American forces than by the Taliban and other insurgents. I don't think there can be a clearer sign that the U.S. military intervention there has failed to secure the Afghan people. Ambassador Wells, it's good to see you again. I want to ask you, why should we expect that doing more of the same thing that we've done for the last 18 years will lead to a different and better outcome than these statistics suggest?
First, I want to say that the U.S. military does everything possible to avoid civilian casualties. Nobody is more meticulous in its planning and as thoughtful in its efforts. And I contrast that to the enemy that we face that deliberately targets civilians. And we've seen that over this bloody last week of targeting of hospitals, targeting
it's horrifying.
of election workers.
But do you dispute the statistics from 2018?
I think, as I mentioned earlier in another response, we do question some of the methodology. I think this is an aberration. And
I hope you're right.
And the approach of the forces couldn't be more different. And so, you know, I'm very, I think we can have confidence and respect for the U.S. military's efforts to reduce civilian casualties and reduce the Afghan forces' civilian casualties. This is not a static, or this is not a static situation. There's been significant change over the last 18 years, and one of those significant changes is the fact that it's the Afghan forces who are doing the fighting and dying. We still suffer tragic losses, and we suffered a tragic loss last week, but the numbers bear no resemblance to the beginning of this conflict and the height of this conflict. And, you know, as time goes by, what we have seen are more capable Afghan forces, more educated, Afghanistan citizens, higher life expectancy, a more sophisticated population. Those are trend lines that absolutely work in our favor and speak very highly of our own values approach to supporting Afghanistan.
All right, I want to talk about the non-state militias in Afghanistan, like the Host Protection Force, that are trained, equipped, and funded by the CIA. These militias were the subject of a New York Times report in December that I'd like to quote from. It said that the CIA-funded militias have, quote, operated unconstrained by battlefield rules designed to protect civilians, conducting night raids, torture, and killings with near impunity in a covert campaign that some Afghan and American officials say is undermining the wider American effort to strengthen Afghan institutions. In July, Ambassador Khalilzad said that militias would be addressed in a peace deal. So, Ambassador Wells, I want to ask you, did the proposed U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan include withdrawing U.S. support for non-state militias funded by the CIA?
I can't speak to that, sir.
Well, in an interview with the BBC this week, the Taliban's chief negotiator said that the negotiation was, quote, the only way for peace in Afghanistan, and quote, from our side, our doors are open for negotiations, and we hope the other side also rethinks their decision regarding negotiation. If we're not talking about these things, do you think we can achieve a sustainable solution?
There's agreement that there is no military solution. There's agreement that there needs to be a politically negotiated solution. But there also has to be confidence that the Taliban, after the 9 rounds of negotiations, are acting in good faith. And so, as has been said publicly by the President and the Secretary, currently the talks are suspended. The administration is reviewing options for moving ahead.
And so, if just as a final question, it's sometimes hard to explain to my constituents what's going on in this complicated situation. How would you suggest that I explain to them why the President suspended negotiations at this point? What's the reason for it?
We saw behavior that was inconsistent with the substance and conduct of the negotiations that have taken place over the last 9 rounds, and it was that inconsistent behavior that led to the decision. We would like to see the Taliban take actions that would make it possible to return to political negotiations.
All right, thanks. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both for stepping up and being here, but I also want to say quite bluntly that it does not absolve Ambassador Khalilzad, who has been negotiating who's been talking to the Taliban for the last year and refusing to speak to the United States Congress. And I do not believe that a classified briefing meets his responsibility to explain to the American people what we are doing here. With that, let me ask you a few questions. The Taliban operates both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, is that correct?
Taliban has sanctuary in Pakistan.
And yet there is nothing in the draft agreement that commits the Taliban to break with al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group that it may be cooperating with in Pakistan, or in fact any of the 20 or so other FTOs beyond al-Qaeda and ISIS, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Haqqani network that operate in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Is that correct?
I can't speak to the details of the text. All I can note is that it is conditions-based with the preeminence given to ending ties to terrorist organizations.
Well, the only terrorist organizations that have been mentioned are those two, and everything you have said suggests that their responsibility ends on Afghan soil. So, in fact, this doesn't really force the Taliban to break with terrorists. There is no ceasefire contemplated, no nationwide ceasefire contemplated by the agreement. So, apart from a few named places under what was contemplated, the Taliban would be able to continue terrorizing the Afghan people. And yet, as I understand it, we may go, were this process to continue, we could go below 8,600 troops. We could go all the way to 0 troops in Afghanistan, even if there is no final intra-Afghan agreement, so long as we have, and if I may quote you, confidence that our security is not impaired. Is that a fair assessment?
Again, I can't speak to the details of the agreement that was being discussed or the political framework that was being discussed. All I can address are the principles that drove it. And the foremost principle is American security, but that has to be also sustainable. What we're looking for is a sustainable solution, a sustainable peace in Afghanistan.
Well, those are two very different things. If the condition is American security as narrowly defined by do not cooperate with al-Qaeda or ISIS, then what that suggests is that what happens to the Afghan people in that scenario is immaterial. So long as we have that minimal commitment from the Taliban, we could go to 0, which puts us in a position where we can't even monitor or enforce that minimal commitment. You said we've been in constant contact with the Afghan government on this question. I'm sure that's true. I know that's true. But any of us who have spoken to the Afghan government know that they do not agree with the basic framework of this agreement for precisely that reason, because it leaves them to the mercy of the Taliban so long as we're assured that they're not going to be cooperating with 2 of the 20 or more terrorist organizations that have safe haven in Afghanistan. My understanding is we're not willing to say, you're not willing to say to the Taliban right here, right now, that we will not go to zero if there is no intra-Afghan agreement. Is that correct? You cannot say that categorically.
I'm not here to comment on the specifics of a negotiation that I wasn't a part of. All I can discuss are the principles. And again, the principles are not, I think you're mischaracterizing the approach of the administration to what we seek to achieve.
Well,
You know,
this is what I've heard from the administration. And again, if you're not able to speak to the agreement, then that is exactly why Ambassador Khalilzad should be sitting in that chair right now. After 1 year of talking to terrorists, he should be willing to talk to the United States Congress. Look, all I'm asking for here is honesty. There are different views about whether we should stay, whether we should go, in both sides of the aisle. But what we are being sold here is not a potential peace agreement. What we are being sold here is a bedtime story to make us feel better about leaving Afghanistan. We're talking about this as if it's supposed to bring peace, when in fact we know that the Taliban intends on continuing to fight because their aim is not legitimacy, their aim is power in Afghanistan, which they're not willing to share with the Afghan government, as they have told us many times. We are being told that this is about bringing our troops home, when in fact those troops are not coming home. They will go to the Gulf. They will go to bases potentially in Central Asia so that we can maintain a forward presence in the region to continue to strike terrorists in Afghanistan. We will continue drone strikes, but from a further distance, which means there will be more civilian casualties, and if we conduct counterterrorism raids, if we do it from a further distance, it'll be more dangerous to our troops. So I'm asking for honesty. If we're going to leave, let us simply say we do not have an interest in investing in Afghanistan anymore, and we're going to leave them to the tender mercies of the Taliban. If we believe that's not right, let's say to the American people that we have a long-term commitment here like we have in South Korea, Germany, and other places. Pick one, but let's stop telling bedtime stories about what this is going to bring.
I'm delighted that there was an opportunity this morning for the committee to be briefed by Ambassador Khalilzad.
But not the American people.
This is not a negotiation of a withdrawal. It's a peace agreement. And I think what we're losing sight of is the overwhelming majority of Afghans who very much want to see America involved in supporting a peace process. Afghans do not want to fight to the last Afghan. They seek peace. And so this administration, has been creatively working towards that goal.
They've had no say in this process, and you know perfectly well that they are terrified, the vast majority of Afghans, about where this is going.
This is the only process that's producing potential of direct conversations between the Taliban, Afghan government, and Afghan stakeholders.
I yield.
Mr. Phillips. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses. I want to start by echoing the sentiment of my colleague, Mr. Malinowski, relative to the lack of an appearance by Mr. Khalilzad. Terribly disappointing, and I hope it is something we can quickly rectify. Former diplomat and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Dr. Ashley Tellis, recently said, quote, "Any attempt at reconciliation through a negotiated bargain centered on the formal exchange of obligations, as opposed to the quiet and progressive defection of insurgents, would fail to deliver stability that the U.S. seeks." Do you agree with that statement? I ask that of both of you.
The administration is exploring, or has been exploring, whether or not you can create a political framework that produces the dialogue that gives confidence that American security will be met. So I obviously would not preemptively agree with Dr. Tellis.
So why would we choose to enter negotiations with such little progress on the battlefield strategically? Is that something, isn't that a question we should be asking?
This is not a conflict that's going to be solved on the battlefield, and you've seen over the last 10 years the number of troops and soldiers go up and go down. What hasn't been able to move forward is the conversations that need to take place between the parties. The government, stakeholders throughout Afghanistan society, which is a very complex one, and the Taliban. The assessment is that the Taliban are different than ISIS, that this has been, a Pashtun nationalist insurgency whose obviously their tactics have become increasingly concerning over the last several years, but that they yet remain committed to an Afghanistan and are prepared to engage, in negotiations. That needs to be tested. And so with the work that's been done has been done to create the conditions where Afghans can actually, for the first time, sit down and begin to have those conversations.
Can you think of a precedent in which we've been successful applying this type of strategy?
I think every war is unique, but certainly the American role is critical and essential in driving any process forward. And so I would focus on the fact that America has received the support of the neighboring countries for the most part. We've certainly been able to work productively with our like-minded partners. Ambassador Khalilzad has been able to work with the Russians and the Chinese because fundamentally this is about interests, and the region does have, to greater or lesser degrees, an interest in Afghanistan stabilizing.
Let's speak about interests. You speak of Russian and Chinese interests. How would you articulate those relative to Afghanistan right now?
I think both countries are concerned by the prospect of the terrorist situation in Afghanistan worsening. And to that extent, we can have a focused conversation about how to move forward in advancing peace. I am not going to suggest that they don't have other motivations, but again, being able to be able to exploit the fact that both countries are concerned about what ISIS represents, that the problem in Afghanistan can get worse as well as get better, is what allows us to, and what has allowed us to organize very dynamic, productive international gatherings and diplomatic architecture in support of a peace process.
So you consider the Chinese and Russians at this stage to be part of the solution?
I think that if important regional countries don't support peace, it will be hard to achieve a peace agreement.
Well, but that's different than being part of the solution. Are they currently?
We've been working with the countries because we do believe that their support will be helpful in advancing a peace agreement.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. I yield back my time.
Actually, would my friend yield to me for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
I thank
Kindly.
my friend. Ambassador Wells, this eerily has the resonance of the Paris negotiations between Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho on trying to negotiate the end of the Vietnam War, and pledges were made. That was a peace agreement too, allegedly. Pledges were made for the North Vietnamese not to invade the South, promptly ignored, and we turned a blind eye to it, making it look like what Mr. Malinowski indicated, a bedtime story, not even a fig leaf. Can you assure us that's not what we're looking at here, that this is different?
President Trump is seeking peace, a negotiated political settlement. He's not seeking a withdrawal agreement.
That's a heck of a reassurance. I'm sure every American can take that to the bank and feel comforted.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Sorry, it was Mr. Phillips' time,
And I do yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just briefly, we've discussed at different times the role of women in negotiations. The Afghan government isn't involved. Women are not part of that. We know that the Afghan government, to my knowledge, is trying to include in the information that's relayed to them, women as part of that agreement. But what do you envision going forward of the role of women, even in negotiations such as they are, not directly, but also going forward, should we move forward with this agreement, really trying to put something in the agreement that guarantees so many of the gains of women in society that have been there since our involvement in Afghanistan, and also considering the view that the Taliban has to women?
how Afghans govern themselves needs to be determined by Afghans. And so, obviously what we hear from the Afghan government and from non-Taliban members of Afghanistan society is their commitment to the gains of the last 18 years, the importance they attach to the constitutional rights, and including the rights of women and girls. And that's backed up by polling, which consistently shows every year an increasing number of Afghans who support education, who support women's participation in the workforce, who support women's voting. A third of all candidates in the parliamentary elections were women. So I think we have profoundly influenced the development of Afghanistan society in a very positive way. And those gains, Afghans are going to have to fight and preserve those gains in a dialogue or in a negotiation with the Taliban. What we can be very crystal clear about, and I think you'll see this in the donor meeting that is happening in London and other sessions that will happen with international donors, is that for Afghanistan to enjoy the support, to receive the benefits of being a member of the international community, it will have to uphold these fundamental rights. And that's the power, I think, that we have, or the greatest power that we have, is that you're not going to get assistance, you're not going to get foreign direct investments, you're not going to get the respect of the international community if you seek to repress or put women back in the home and out of schools.
I have sponsored a legislation that hopefully will soon be coming forward to say that if there's other types of resources going forward that the U.S. is going to supply to the Afghan government, that those guarantees for women remain in place. Is that something you agree with?
All of our programs have embedded in them women's participation and support for women's rights in Afghanistan. It's an operating principle. I think Karen can speak to that.
Yes, Ms. Freeman.
Thank you. Been waiting for that moment for a long time. Yes, in every single program that we have, there is a requirement for the inclusion of women in those programs. In particular, and with respect to the current question at hand, we have been actively working with civil society and women's business chambers, et cetera, to help them to improve their negotiating skills, to help them to hone their messages, their expectations, to be realistic and pragmatic about the way forward, and to ensure that when and if they do have the place at that meeting, that they'll be ready for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I hope that this committee, moving forward very shortly, will be able to go forward with that and put additional safeguards to protect the gains that women and girls have certainly been advantaged from in Afghanistan. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank the panel for what was a very lengthy hearing this morning, and thank you for taking the time to do that. We'll pause just briefly so the staff can reset the witnesses for the second panel. Thank you again. The committee will reconvene. I'd like to introduce our second panel and thank them for their patience this morning, which indeed was, after a very extensive first panel hearing. Ambassador James Cunningham is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asian Center and an adjunct faculty member at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. He served at the State Department for decades in a wide range of roles, capping his distinguished career with his time as ambassador to Afghanistan from 2012 to 2014. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Asia Society, and the American Academy of Diplomacy. Thank you for being here, Ambassador. Ms. Laurel Miller is director of the Crisis Group's Asia program, where she leads the organization's research, analysis, and policy advocacy dealing with that region from 2013 to 2017. She was the deputy and then acting Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the State Department. And in previous service at the department, worked on numerous issues, including peace negotiations in Bosnia. She also served on the staff of the National Security Council. Welcome, and thank you again, Ms. Miller. Mr. Thomas Jocelyn is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a senior editor of FDD's Long War Journal. He has worked as a trainer for the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, and he's written widely on counterterrorism and issues that are related to counterterrorism. I'd like to welcome to you all without objection. The witness' prepared testimony will be made part of the record, and I'll now allow the witnesses to testify for 5 minutes each to summarize their testimony. Let's start with Ambassador Cunningham.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. While the specifics of the deal negotiated by U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation Khalilzad remain unknown, its apparent elements raise serious concern about failure in its application. Now that President Trump has called a halt to the discussions with the Taliban, the opportunity exists, if the administration will take it, to course correct and seek a better deal that will lead to a political agreement ending the conflict, the goal which President Trump correctly set 2 years ago. A flawed deal on withdrawal of U.S. forces, one not grounded in the context of an actual peace agreement, risks the collapse of Afghanistan into chaos, the return of the oppressive and extremist Taliban emirate, and the growth of the Islamist terrorist threat to Western security and values. The American Afghan peoples and our many international partners in Afghanistan deserve better. One side negotiating against a deadline is at a severe disadvantage when the other is not, and Ambassador Khalilzad has been operating under extremely complex conditions. But an agreement which fails, in fact, to open the way to peace for Afghanistan will be a defeat for U.S. leadership and values and sacrifice unnecessarily U.S. and Afghan interest in stability and security in that troubled region. Certainly, a discussion with the Taliban about ending the conflict is to be welcomed, but hope for an intra-Afghan dialogue is not a strategy, and there is little to suggest that a Taliban version of peace would be acceptable to the vast majority of Afghans or to the international community. Taliban representatives have told other Afghans that the United States is defeated and that they will restore the Islamic Emirate. While they suggest that the Emirate would be less severe and barbaric, there is little doubt what that would mean for today's Afghanistan, nor of the risks that outcome would pose for Afghan women. Negotiations should be resumed as soon as possible, but on a different basis, geared to actually ending the conflict. A sound deal with the Taliban will involve the Afghan government. It will, as a first step, end the violence by making the discussion of U.S. withdrawal contingent upon a ceasefire which ends the killing of Afghans. While forces can be reduced based on conditions as a ceasefire takes hold, it will make a durable peace agreement between the universally recognized Afghan government and the Taliban the sine qua non for the ultimate withdrawal of international forces. That negotiation, in turn, must take into account the reality, as demonstrated by the horrific ISIS bombing of a Kabul wedding hall last month, that future Afghan governments will likely require international assistance in combating terrorism. They will also, without doubt, require significant international donor support for a peace agreement. A new Taliban emirate will be deserving of neither. There has been much discussion in the past weeks about the futility of continued U.S. engagement in Afghanistan and American fatigue and calls for withdrawal, often without addressing the consequences. Peace negotiations on the terms we, most Afghans, and our international partners would seek will be difficult but not impossible to create. We have not adequately tested the proposition, which requires a complex diplomatic and military effort and continued support for the Afghan security forces. We have long recognized that a military solution is not in the offing, but a peace process does require an adequate military instrument in support of a multilateral, multifaceted, high-level diplomatic campaign to set the conditions for negotiations. The irony of where we are today is that President Trump's South Asia strategy, announced 2 years ago, corrected the shortcomings which handicapped President Obama's efforts to withdraw U.S. forces and establish a peace process. Knowing that President Obama had a timeline for bringing our troops home, the Taliban had no incentive to negotiate. In 2017, President Trump agreed to restore military capabilities needed to strengthen the American train and assist and counterterrorism missions, and to focus on creating conditions for negotiations. His strategy for peace correctly aligned 3 elements for getting the Taliban to genuine negotiations: bolstering the Afghan security forces, basing the reduction and eventual withdrawal of military forces on conditions and not artificial deadlines, and focusing on Afghanistan's regional context, particularly on ending the nefarious role of Pakistan. That strategy was aimed at success, a political settlement, including respect for the Afghan Constitution and its protections for human rights, women, and a free media. It appears to be coming apart. The reestablishment of unrealistic U.S. deadlines will again undercut the Afghan security forces. Deadlines and the ever-present threat of withdrawal absent an agreement encourage Taliban intransigence. Speculation about an interim government, which hopefully is now moot, risked the demise of democracy in Afghanistan. Washington appears yet again to have allowed Pakistan to avoid concrete action to change the calculations of the Taliban leadership in Pakistan. Afghanistan is neither a failed state nor to be dismissed as a forever war. Afghanistan is a struggling, democratic Islamic partner in the generational conflict between extreme Islamist ideology and terrorism and the civilized world to which most people, including Muslims, aspire. Our 18-year effort in Afghanistan has had several distinct phases, and mistakes have surely been made. But yielding to fatigue rather than correcting our strategy would be the greatest mistake of all. The costs of engagement in Afghanistan are much lower than in the past, can be lower yet, and are sustainable. As with the Cold War, staying power will be required to win the ideological conflict with Islamist extremism, in which Afghanistan is a chapter. We can certainly be smarter and more effective, but as with Iraq, the costs of premature withdrawal from Afghanistan, with the prospects of peace unsecured, will be much higher. Among the more important of those costs will be the accelerated erosion of the notion that the United States is a reliable and durable partner when there is a price to be paid for leadership and defense of U.S. values. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Congressman Keating, for your endurance today, and my thanks to the committee for inviting me to this important hearing. I've been asked to assess the administration's efforts to secure a peace deal. I'll summarize my written statement, briefly reviewing U.S. policy options and explaining why the negotiations President Trump declared dead last week should be revived. Those talks produced a draft U.S. Taliban agreement that, according to both sides, was ready to be signed. The U.S. has 3 basic options. First, the withdrawal option. The U.S. could plan and execute a pullout of all U.S. forces. The conflict would continue, and it would probably intensify and become more chaotic. There's a strong chance the anti-Taliban side would fracture. How quickly that would happen would depend on whether the government in Kabul continued to receive the foreign funding on which it very heavily depends. Second, the stay the course option. The U.S. could keep the current or somewhat reduced number of troops, continue fighting the Taliban alongside the government, continue operations against the Islamic State branch, and occasionally other terrorist groups from within Afghanistan. The war, currently the deadliest in the world, would remain the bloody stalemate that it is today and that many senior American military officers have said it is, one that's been eroding in the Taliban's favor over several years. Keeping U.S. troops in Afghanistan would continue feeding the Taliban narrative of foreign occupation that they used to recruit. Staying the course means perpetuating the conflict with no foreseeable end. Third, the negotiation option. The U.S. could try to negotiate an end to the war and to the U.S. military presence. American diplomats have engaged in about 9 years of waxing and waning effort to launch a peace process, but only this year did the U.S. put pursuing a peace deal at the center of its policy. The third option is the only one with the potential to reduce violence in Afghanistan and enable the U.S. troops to withdraw in permissive conditions. It's also the option with the best chance of preserving Afghanistan's social and development gains. To be clear, none of these options has the realistic potential to result in military victory for the U.S. and its Afghan allies. Neither of the first two options would enable the Afghan government to become self-sustaining in its fight against the Taliban at any foreseeable time, and only the negotiation option aims for reduction of violence. Some have criticized the administration for negotiating exclusively with the Taliban, supposedly cutting out the Afghan government. It's understandable this approach is deeply frustrating to many Afghans, and frankly, it's distasteful to many in Washington. The U.S. decision to negotiate first with the Taliban prior to talks among Afghans was a concession to the Taliban's stubborn insistence on that sequence. The U.S. for many years resisted that sequencing, and the cost was no peace process. It's worth underscoring that the U.S. already tried and failed to deliver the more desirable kind of peace process, with the Afghan government at the table from the outset and with an early ceasefire. No evidence suggests the Afghan government on its own could launch this preferred form of peace talks. Certainly the U.S. has not stood in the way. But it's crucial to recognize what a U.S.-Taliban deal would and would not be. It would cover a limited set of issues, the withdrawal of U.S. troops in exchange for Taliban commitments to prevent Afghanistan being a safe harbor for terrorist groups. The deal would not be a peace agreement. There's no deal between the U.S. and Taliban that could bring peace or address governance, women's rights, and other issues. The deal would be the first step toward peacemaking. It would condition a gradual U.S. withdrawal, which the Taliban want, on the Taliban entering negotiations with the Afghan government and other power brokers. The reward is clear. The deal would open the door to an Afghan peace process. Afghan talks, once started, might stall or fail for many reasons. The gap between the parties' political visions might prove too great. Internal divisions on each side might prove too difficult to overcome. If negotiations fail, the U.S. will still be in a position to choose either of the first two policy options I described earlier. After nearly 18 years of prioritizing military action and failing to defeat the Taliban, the U.S. has spent only 1 year putting peace efforts at the forefront. And in that time, it appears to have come close to clinching a deal that would lead to an Afghan peace process and allow for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. The U.S. should not abandon this effort now.
Mr. Jocelyn. Well, thank you for having me here to testify again today. I'm going to just go through this very quickly. I agree that one of the main critiques of the process that the Trump administration went through in these talks basically excluded the Afghan government. You can see in a tweet I reproduced in my written testimony that on March 12th of this year, Ambassador Khalilzad said explicitly that once a deal is finalized, exchanging a troop withdrawal for the supposed counterterrorism assurances from the Taliban, then the intra-Afghan negotiations process would start. That's a crucial mistake. Obviously, if you're gonna try and actually launch a peace process, having American troops in country are your biggest bargaining chip to try and get that launched. Giving it away at the outset in exchange for the Taliban's words makes no sense to me. And I want to talk a little bit today about why the Taliban's words shouldn't be trusted when it comes to counterterrorism assurances. There's some skepticism in the earlier panel on this regard, and I wholly endorse that skepticism. I'm going to run through 5 key issues in that regard very quickly. First, the Taliban hasn't come clean about its past at any point in time. In July, the Taliban released a video in which they said that 9/11 was a heavy slap on their dark faces, was the consequence of their interventionist policies and not our doing. In other words, they were justifying 9/11. They didn't blame al-Qaeda. They didn't renounce their decision to harbor al-Qaeda prior to 9/11. They said it was a result of our policies, which is a talking point they've had since 2001. In addition, in August, Suhail Shaheen, who's participated in the talks in Doha as a chief Taliban negotiator, said he didn't know who did 9/11. He didn't know, and if we have evidence of this, then maybe we can bring that forward and we can try and prosecute it. Well, I'll just say this. We know who did 9/11, right? And you can see in my testimony, I've excerpted quite a few parts of this report, the 9/11 Commission report, showing the Taliban's complicity and safe haven for al-Qaeda and how crucial that was for al-Qaeda in the run-up to 9/11. And there's a number of reports and citations in my written testimony to this in that regard. So we don't need Suhail Shaheen to tell us we don't know who did it. But the key point there is, if they're not willing to come clean about the past, why are you willing to believe what they're saying about the future? Why are you willing to believe that their assurances going forward are really firm? Second point, in July 2016, Ambassador Khalilzad testified before this committee, and during that hearing, he actually highlighted the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, had sworn his personal allegiance to Habatul Akhundzada, who is basically the supreme leader. They call him the Emir of the Faithful for the Taliban. And Ambassador Khalilzad said that showed that the relationship continues. We agree. I had reported on that about a week or two earlier. And as far as I can tell, there's no evidence that Akhundzada to date is going to renounce Zawahiri's oath of allegiance or al-Qaeda. And as part of any talks that you heard a lot in the first panel about how there's assurances from the Taliban about breaking with al-Qaeda and restraining them and that sort of thing. Well, here's a very concrete example of what the Taliban could do in that regard and should do in that regard if you're going to actually start to believe them, which is that their leader, Habatul Akhundzada, should disown Zawahiri and his oath of allegiance. Very quickly, third point, the number 2 of the Taliban is a guy named Siraj Haqqani. And we've tracked Siraj Haqqani for a long time, and it took a number of years to get the Haqqani network designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. government. That network was designated in part because the Haqqani network remains closely allied with al-Qaeda throughout its history, going back from the 1980s to this day. Siraj Haqqani is not only the number 2 in the Taliban, but actually oversees the Taliban's war machine across Afghanistan. There's a lot of evidence in my written testimony about how the Haqqanis remain intertwined with al-Qaeda. There's a lot more I could say in that regard. I've seen no evidence that Siraj Haqqani was going to break with al-Qaeda or anybody in the Haqqanis. We're going to do that. Number 4, al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. This is highlighted in my testimony as well. It was created in 2014. There's plenty of evidence that AQIS, as it's known, is fighting alongside the Taliban's members throughout the country. Al-Qaeda and AQIS members serve as religious and military instructors for the Taliban. They remain embedded in the Taliban. In fact, a special Inspector General report submitted to Congress earlier this year highlighted the fact that actually many, according to this report, many Al-Qaeda members are actually dual Al-Qaeda and Taliban members. That's how integrated they are. And so a lot of times you can't even tell who's an al-Qaeda guy and who's a Taliban guy. Believe me, I'm the nerd who tracks this stuff. That's true. Sometimes you can't tell who's who, but that's how intertwined they are. And 5th, in terms of counterterrorism assurances from the Taliban, there's a sort of a constellation of Central Asian, Uyghur, and Pakistani jihadi groups fighting under the Taliban's banner in Afghanistan. I see no reason to believe the Taliban has agreed to restrain them in any meaningful way. We're talking about Uzbek groups like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, the Islamic Jihad Union. We're talking about the Turkestan Islamic Party, which fights in Syria and Afghanistan. We're talking about Lashkar-e-Taiba. The UN reports I cite in my testimony all document their presence in Afghanistan under the Taliban's banner, and I find it hard to believe that the Taliban will restrain all of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses. Mr. Jocelyn, I'll start with you. Clearly, from your testimony, you have little faith or confidence in the Taliban. being trustworthy for a good reason. So what should we do in light of the fact that they're not, in your estimation? What would be in our best interest?
I have no problem with trying to bolster a process that includes the Afghan government in the talks and insisting on that from the go. My main problem with what happened here was, one, I think there was a lot of credulity when it came to the Taliban's words on counterterrorism assurances from Ambassador Khalilzad and others. And two, the Afghan government clearly didn't have a formal seat at the table. You heard Ambassador Wells talk about how some members of the Afghan government were able to take part in talks, but that was in a personal capacity, not as formal representatives of the U.S.-backed, internationally legitimate Afghan government. So if you're going to go down that path, then it's fine, but as long as you're insisting that the Afghan government is part of any legitimate peace process.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, I know you've been involved in peace negotiations in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia. In general terms, what does a good peace negotiation look like, and what does a good agreement look like?
It would have been my preference and my recommendation that the peace process should have included the Afghan government, the U.S., and the Taliban at the table simultaneously from the start. However, that was the format that the United States long tried to pursue. I was personally involved in efforts to try to get the peace process started that way. But it didn't work. The Taliban refused, and it's a sad fact that the Taliban has leverage in this equation. So as I said in my statement, it was a concession, and it was, but I think an unfortunately necessary concession to split the peace talks into two separate tracks, a U.S. Taliban track followed by an intra-Afghan track, as it's now called. In terms of what a peace agreement could actually look like, the preliminary agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban is only setting the stage for a potential peace agreement and a peace process. An actual peace agreement among the Afghan parties is going to have to address a wide range of issues, including political arrangements for Afghanistan, security arrangements for Afghanistan, implementation measures, verification measures. And so it will be complex, and it will take time to negotiate that. And frankly, the U.S.-Taliban agreement is only useful insofar as you actually get to that second stage. It doesn't, as I said, bring peace to Afghanistan, nor is it actually necessary for the United States to negotiate with the Taliban the terms of its withdrawal. If all the U.S. wants to do is withdraw, it doesn't need to negotiate that with anyone. And I would agree that counterterrorism assurances in that context are meaningless. Those only become meaningful if you have the second stage of a peace process and you're able to form a consolidated Afghan government that brings the Taliban into the political fabric. I would just add to that, I think we have to be a little bit cautious in painting. I have no disagreement with the negative characterizations on the whole of the Taliban, but I think we need to be careful not to paint this in black and white terms. There are plenty of non-Taliban Afghans, including some who are closely aligned with the Afghan government, who also have very conservative viewpoints on social issues, and frankly, who have a past history of very close involvement with al-Qaeda. With al-Qaeda, I repeat. It's a complicated picture that isn't just a pure black and white situation. I hope I answered your question.
And in your past negotiations, are there any that are analogous to this current dynamic that we have in Afghanistan that you can point to?
I would say in general terms, yes, but I don't think that there's a clear and obvious template for this. And I've looked I've done research on a sort of comparative analysis of other peace agreements and peace processes around the world compared to the situation in Afghanistan. And there's no one situation you can point to. I think what you can say is that one of the factors that makes peacemaking in Afghanistan much more difficult than in other circumstances is that it's a stalemate.
Right.
That you don't have, this isn't Colombia, where the government was overwhelmingly more powerful than the FARC. This isn't a situation like Bosnia where the outside powers that were backing the inside powers really had the say and decided they were going to go with a peace process. And NATO was able to apply overwhelming force to the situation. This is more complicated because it's a stalemate and neither side has truly come to terms with their own ability to succeed or fail militarily.
Indeed. I'm out of time, but I know there's not a long line behind me. Maybe we'll have another chance in a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. President Trump said the peace talks are dead. Do you believe they're dead, Ambassador?
I believe they're not dead, and they shouldn't be dead.
Ms. Miller, do you believe the President when he says the peace talks are dead?
I believe that President Trump has shown remarkable agility in being able to change his positions rapidly. And so I think it's certainly, there's a lot of opportunity here to resuscitate the peace process. It may take a little time and some face saving in order to do it.
Mr. Jocelyn, do you think that, do you agree that President, that the peace talks are dead?
I don't know. All I can say is that I know from the outset, I think it was very clear the President has wanted a full withdrawal or something close to it, and that sort of was the framework for the entirety for the talks.
Yeah, I would say the fact that any of you or members of Congress can answer that question presents a problem with the talks. We don't even know if they're dead or not, or if they're there. So that's the status of it. Let's assume we go forward, whether they're suspended, whether we begin anew at some time. Ambassador, I thought you brought a very important point forward. If that's going to happen, and we, whatever term you want to use, Lazarus appears and these are no longer dead, the importance of, while these negotiations are going on, being able to maintain a ceasefire, I think is critical. What is your opinion?
I would think it's important to get to a ceasefire as quickly as possible, particularly given the ongoing campaign against Afghan civilians being waged by the Taliban as we're talking about creating a peace process. Now, this is obviously leverage for the Taliban. They're trying to use military force and terrorism to enhance their position. But as we go about resetting this, I would hope that there would be a serious effort to draw a clearer line between this discussion and the actual negotiation of peace than I think exists. You have a better understanding now of the agreement than we do, because you've been briefed and we haven't. But there are several...
Well, we don't know if the agreement's alive.
The agreement needs to be adjusted, I think, but the goal needs to be kept in mind that the agreement is really, as Laurel said, the agreement is kind of a key to getting into a peace negotiation. My problem is it's not clear that that key is going to work, or that it's strong enough.
Well, here's another point, and Mr. Jocelyn, mentioned the Khanis. Ambassador, you mentioned Pakistan. I mean, it seems like these factors may not be front and center in some of these negotiations, and without that kind of discussion, how inhibited is our ability to proceed?
I think our ability is gravely inhibited.
Mr. Jocelyn?
Pakistan has a key role to play here.
I would suggest you look at Ambassador Khalilzad's personal Twitter account before he became special representative, and you'll see that he was very forthright about Pakistan's role in harboring and sponsoring the Khanis and others who are directing the attacks in Afghanistan, and that is an issue that I do not think is going to be solved.
And I would just suggest one other thing. If we are going to reset or whatever might happen, words count when you're dealing diplomatically in negotiations. And I personally think, and if you have any comments on this in this regard, instead of talking about a U.S. withdrawal, we should be talking about Afghan and the Afghan government being able to negotiate our presence involved. It might sound like semantics, but I don't think it is. Ambassador.
I think that's a good point, and I don't exclude at the end of this process, which will take a lot longer than anybody would want, I would not exclude that there would be an agreement on an enduring U.S. presence and military presence in Afghanistan at a much lower level that would be focused on a counterterrorism mission. There's no reason to, as I hinted at in my statement, there's no reason to think that a future Afghan government, even if constituted under a peace agreement, is going to have the capability on its own to deal with terrorism within Afghanistan and the region.
Great. I only hope that any further negotiations have the tenacity of Mr. Phillips. He's still here, and he wanted to allow him to have the last few minutes to ask some more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Cunningham, you've said that if there's going to be any negotiation between the Taliban and the Afghans, that the Afghans will need a legitimate political authority to have that discussion. So perhaps you could apprise us as to the status of elections in Afghanistan and what we, Congress and the United States, can do to strengthen and secure democratic elections.
The status now, although another problem with the way these discussions have been conducted up to now is that, among other things, it created a wide series of rumors within Afghanistan about what the American attitude was toward elections and whether they would be held or not. And that created a lot of uncertainty, obviously. Now it looks like they will be held. They're scheduled. The apparatus is in place. They will be flawed as they have. I lived through the last elections. It was a most unpleasant experience. They will be flawed again, but they will be, I think, they will be successful in reestablishing a legitimate political authority in Afghanistan as a result of the exercise of the voting franchise by the Afghan people. One thing we do know about Afghanistan is that Afghans like to vote, even if it's dangerous for them to do so. And I expect and hope that that will be the case again this time, and I hope very much so that the election results will be clear enough that it won't lead to a series of protracted disputes as it did the last time around.
And is there anything that we or the international community can and should be doing proactively to
provide political support and economic support to the actual negotiations themselves?
Okay.
Messaging the Afghan political class that they have a responsibility not to allow this to degenerate into a political conflict as it did before, and providing encouragement for them that when they have a political outcome, that it will be supported by the United States and our partners.
Okay, thank you. And then a final question for each of you. I asked this at the last panel. I'll repeat it. Dr. Ashley Tellis, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, said recently, any attempt at reconciliation through a negotiated bargain centered on the formal exchange of obligations, as opposed to the quiet and progressive defection of insurgents, would fail to deliver stability that the U.S. seeks. So on the subject of defection of insurgents, love your thoughts, respectively, on strategies that we should be considering to inspire the defection of the insurgents that we're battling. Anyone who wants to start? Ms. Miller?
There have been a number of strategies that have been implemented over the years aimed at that, aimed at trying to split the Taliban or encourage defections. They are all almost entirely failures. And I do not expect that there's any strategy that can succeed in that. There's a lot of talk about the fractures in the Taliban, lack of cohesion within the Taliban. A lot of that is, frankly, wishful thinking and propaganda. Yes, I'm not saying they're an entirely monolithic organization, but let's face it, they have remained more unified and more cohesive than the other side has in this conflict. And they have been very careful to protect their cohesion, including through harsh measures of imposing ultimate sanctions on those who have sought to defect from the group, because they've been cognizant of the fact that sufficient cohesion has been their comparative advantage. So there's no quiet defection strategy to resolving this conflict.
Mr. Jocelyn?
I have a very grim view of the answer to your question. I think I wrote last year that I think in terms of where this war is headed, we've already lost if you game it all out. Especially with President Trump's commitment to withdrawing troops, I think that he basically, I find it very hard to believe that there's going to be some turnaround now here militarily. My issue is that going forward, and I agree totally, and I've said this myself publicly, if you're going to withdraw troops, I have no reason to absolve the Taliban on the way out the door on counterterrorism issues. It doesn't make any sense to me, especially when you're not getting any sort of real firm commitments that they're going to actually sit down for real talks with the Afghan government or anything along those lines. But I don't think there is a turnaround strategy at this point. There's no silver bullet, unfortunately.
Okay. Ambassador?
I agree. I don't think there's a strategy of attrition or withdrawal that will work in any time frame that we would want to see, certainly. That attrition will take place over time, hopefully in the context of a political agreement that does establish protections and rights and obligations. And there are serious issues that need to be addressed, like the status of the Afghan Constitution and the role of women and other things that we've been talking about, that of education, all those things that have made today's Afghanistan so different from what it was 18, 19, 20 years ago. Those things need to be built into a fabric that provides a solution. It can't be kind of left to drift along, and that won't happen, in my view.
So one final question, and just a yes and no from each of you. Is it, in your estimation, starting with you, Mr. Ambassador, do you think that the Taliban would be willing to agree to just about anything that would ultimately lead to the withdrawal of our troops, anticipating that we would be hesitant to ever return?
Whether they would be willing to agree to almost anything, I doubt. But they certainly have an incentive to, depending on, again, the crucial question, what the timeline is. Mm-hmm. They want us out. They'll be willing to do what's necessary to get us out. The question is, will that be at the end of a peace agreement or before there's a peace agreement? One thing I think you can count on is that they won't have any compunction about taking advantage of a situation in which we're not there and the Afghans are weak.
Indeed. Ms. Miller?
They have their red lines, and they, you know, regardless of anything that President Trump or President Obama said about desiring to get out of Afghanistan, they know for a certainty that America will not be in Afghanistan forever, and they will.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Mr. Jocelyn?
I don't think they'd agree to say or do anything, but basically the point of my testimony is that if you're going to believe them on counterterrorism assurances, I've given you 5 different things that you have to look for in terms of any sort of agreement in that regard. Obviously, the agreement looks moribund right now, but with officials saying that they believe in the Taliban's counterterrorism assurances, I say, okay, well then show me the following.
Indeed. Thank you all for being here, for your testimony and counsel. Appreciate it. I yield back.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. You know, this is an extremely important issue. It doesn't receive perhaps the greatest public attention that it deserves. I echo the sentiments of some of my colleagues that we should have had better representation, not that you're not great, but people that are directly involved in the negotiations currently here informing us and the American public what goes on. We should do that for the families and friends of loved ones that lost their lives, both on the military side and civilian side, in this long, long war. We should do that for the military and civilian and their families and loved ones that are currently there in that region. And as I conclude, I think of one story when I was there a few years ago, visiting our troops and getting briefed. I often asked our military, brave military soldiers, you know, if there's anything I can ever do or we can do for you, let us know. And on this occasion, they asked us, yes, there is. There's someone we would like you to meet and thank. And they took us to the marketplace. And there we met a civilian from Afghanistan. I won't mention even what province, although I suspect he's not alive at this point. But he had been risking his life, providing information to our troops about where IEDs were placed, about other tactics where undoubtedly he was saving lives. And they had asked us and myself to just go to this man and thank him, that it would mean a lot. And when I had that opportunity, I asked him why he was risking his life doing that. And at that point, he went from behind him and pulled out his 8-year-old son. And he said, because I would love him to have a chance in life, a chance he doesn't have under the current conditions. And I hope that this intervention, this action by America will give him that chance. So I hope that we do the most in these negotiations, as difficult as they are, not just for those who have sacrificed so much and continue to for our country, but for those people as well. With that thought, I will call the hearing and adjourn. Thank you.